intimate enough for you?
That is intimate enough for me, yeah.
Good afternoon. We want to remind people that this is going to be an interactive session, so the closer to the front or middle that you can be would be great for the interactions that are planned for this afternoon. Good afternoon. I am Jamie Baker. I will be the facilitator for this session. Nicole Palumbo and Lisa Gregg will be in the back. So there will be two of us in the back and myself in the front. I'd just like to make a few announcements before we begin this afternoon's session. The exhibit hall is open until 5 today. Quiet rooms are available in 113 and 114. The nursing room is located in room 116. And also additionally this year we have a patent pod room in 115 where participants are encouraged to discuss, provide feedback, and provide some information about the sessions that you've attended during the conference to kind of put into a podcast. The poster session, reception, and art of expression exhibit is from 4:30 to 6:30 in the Dean's Hall. We've been telling everybody all day there is a cash bar there as well. Remember, in order to get continuing education credits, you must complete and hand in a verification form at the registration desk prior to departing on your last day of attendance. This is where you'll put the codes given at the end of each presentation. You can access the PowerPoint and any handouts for this session via the conference website. We are also asking that upon completion of each presentation that you give us feedback for that session via the conference website. Now I'd like to introduce the presenter. Ami Klin, PhD, is the Georgia Research Alliance Eminent Scholar Professor and Chief of the Division of Autism and Developmental Disabilities at Emory University School of Medicine and Director of the Marcus Autism Center, Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. He obtained his PhD from the University of London and completed clinical and research postdoctoral fellowship at the Yale Child Study Center. He directed the autism program at the Yale Child Study Center, Yale University School of Medicine, until 2010, where he was the Harris Professor of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. The Marcus Autism Center is one of the largest centers of clinical care in the country, providing a broad range of diagnostic and treatment services. It is also a National Institutes of Health Autism Center of Excellence with a comprehensive interdisciplinary program of research in clinical and basic science. Collaborative projects include several departments at Emory and other institutions, such as the Centers for Disease Control and the Yerkes National Primate Research Center, as well as care providing agencies in the community. The center also provides training in a broad range of disciplines and is strongly committed to advocacy research activities focused on social mind and social brain and on developmental aspects of autism from infancy through adulthood. These studies include novel techniques such as eye tracking laboratories, co-directed with Warren Jones, which allow researchers to see the world through the eyes of individuals with autism. These techniques are being applied in the screening of toddlers at risk for autism. He is the author of more than 200 publications in the field of autism and related conditions. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ami Klin.
Thank you, and sorry for the lengthy presentation, but I appreciate it. Very, very generous. My name is Ami Klin, and I'm the director of the Marcus Autism Center at Emory and Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. My adult life has been spent trying to make a difference in the lives of individuals with autism and their families. And today, I'm going to focus primarily on the way in which some of the research that we have been involved with begin to address some of the most pressing public health challenges in autism. And it all begins with relationships. And I'm going to focus a great deal of what I'm going to talk about on infants and toddlers, even though I'm going to talk about older individuals as well. But I would love for this session to be relevant to you, because I'm trying to take the perspective of your presence here. And so I like to make sure that you see me as someone who may be able to address some of the questions that have been in your mind. And as I present, I'm going to make several pauses in which I'm going to solicit questions from you. So I do want you to engage with me. As social engagement is very much part of my presentation, but it's also part of our activity right now. So I'd love to know in what ways I can be of help to the kind of issues or challenges or whatever it is that crosses your mind. I assume that you're here because you're interested in autism, and maybe your life, the life of your family is touched by autism. So maybe you're a parent, maybe you are an educator, maybe you are a clinical professional, maybe you're an advocate. But I really would like to make sure that I have an opportunity to address whatever is in your mind. Okay? So that's important, because otherwise you're going to fall asleep as I speak for 3 hours. The second thing is that this is being live streamed. Otherwise, I'll be walking through the halls. I'm sort of a Queen fan, I guess. I would love to be able to sort of to be among the folks that I am talking with, but I need to be right here because of the live stream. That's where the light is, that's where the camera is, and that's the reason why I'm here. Okay. So I have to thank a lot of people for the work that we have been developing over the years. I was at Yale for 20 years, and since 2011 I've been in Atlanta, and of course the children, the families, all of our funding agencies. And no, I don't have any conflicts of interest. All right, so this is the Marcus Autism Center. This is an area view taken on a Sunday morning. That's why you don't see any cars parked in the 263 parking spots that we have there. But it's a 90,000 square foot building, 1.9 acre lot, and we are about half a mile from Emory School of Medicine and from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. You need more? The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We are a mission-driven organization. And our hope is that we adjust our services, and we also adjust our science in order to address questions, issues, challenges that can generate tangible benefits for the children and families that we see. That's what the center is about. It's an interesting place because at the same time that we are a division in the School of Medicine, we are also part of one of the largest systems of pediatric health care in the country. Children's Health Care of Atlanta have the monopoly of pediatric health care in the state of Georgia. And therefore, the good news is that whatever we do it gives us an opportunity to reach out to the community at large. And that's what this is about. And every piece of science, hopefully, that we engage in needs to have this kind of relevant clinical endpoint in the near future. Most of the things that we do have to do with providing services. So we are a very large diagnostic center, close to 2,000 diagnostic evaluations a year, but we are primarily a treatment center. Providing treatment on a whole range of issues, from some of the core symptoms of autism, issues that have to do with speech, language, and communication, but also to the other issues that emerge with time. Many of our children show very severe behavior challenges. So we have a very large severe behavior unit. We have a very large program for feeding disorders, and we have a lot of clinical trials for psychopharmacological clinical trials, for behavioral clinical trials, for parent training clinical trials, and we have care coordination. But everything that happens in the center needs to happen in the community. So we have a lot of outward reaching programs. We have a care coordination program so that our families have the supports to navigate the system. We have an educational outreach program. We work with 28, I believe, school districts in the state of Georgia, training whole districts. and we have an infant and toddler community outreach in which we are working directly with primary care physicians and early interventionists, and as well as with the families. The nice thing about our center is that we are mission-driven, and we have this tremendously stupid economic model that we lose about 60 cents on the dollar of service that we provide because close to 60% of our population are on Medicaid. But that gives us tremendous opportunities. We need to be efficient. We need to come up with new treatment models that are going to provide accessibility not to a small group of people who can pay for it, but really the community at large. So community viability is a major part of our mission. The other thing is that having been, I think I know virtually all the autism centers around the country, when you write your papers, you really research on autism tends to be research on white boys and middle class or upper class sort of white boys. And so it's very important for us to remember that there are females with autism and there are low-income families that also have children with autism. And the center gives us an opportunity to reach out, and given the large volume of patients and research subjects that we see, we have an opportunity to address these orphans of research. Most of what I have here you probably know, but I need to emphasize that autism, I started in the field many years ago, in the 80s. I trained in England, and at the time, the prevalence of autism is to be quoted as 4 per 10,000, a very rare condition. And about 80% of those individuals or more who were identified as having autism, they were supposed to be individuals with a significant level of intellectual disability. Now, all of that changed. People talk about the epidemic of autism. Probably it's safer to say they were finally getting things right, which basically we're going out there in the community, and the prevalence studies are showing something very different. This is actually the most common complex neurodevelopmental disorder of all. 1 in 59 children. What does that mean? It means that there are some 5 million to 6 million individuals with autism in this country. It means that 66,000 children are born every year who will have autism in the U.S. alone. And we're also finding out that we understand autism, but you know what? Some of the work that we're doing, and that's probably one of the big lessons that we've had for the past 10 years or so, is that the things that we do in autism are also relevant to a much broader group of kids, the kids who have other developmental issues, such as language problems, such as communication problems, not necessarily autism, but basically the same kinds of solutions that we're finding on autism are in fact beneficial to a much broader group of kids. So keep that in mind. Now, autism is more common than all childhood cancers, juvenile diabetes. I could go through the range of different things that comes to your mind as something affecting children. Autism is more common than that, all put together. Now, the societal cost of this condition is in excess of $120 billion a year. Important to keep in mind, this is a major public health issue. And not only that, most of those funds, they go in order to provide supports to older individuals, and particularly during adulthood, and particular individuals who have a level of intellectual disability. It's very costly. Now, one important number to keep in mind is that if you are a parent, the cost of having a child with autism is in excess of $2 to $3 million over a lifetime. What does that mean? It means that autism is also an enormous economic burden for families. And here is the thing that we started to find out about maybe some 10 years ago, but it's now crystal clear. When I started in this field, and I worked primarily, I lived in a residential unit for adults with autism who had spent all of their lives in long-stay hospitals. And all of those individuals were profoundly disabled. All of these individuals basically appear to have a condition that was immutable. What can we do? This is the brain, isn't it? But this is the thing that we found out. from the past 10 to 12 years, not only us, but many, many groups around the world, have begun to follow babies from the time they're born. And we start seeing how autism develops. And one critical learning to keep in mind is that autism is enormously plastic, meaning malleable early on in life. And that, in fact, early intervention can make a very significant impact and optimize children's outcomes. We also found out that in the definition of autism, you don't have language disorders, you don't have intellectual disabilities, you don't have severe behavior challenges. Those are things that emerge with time. And the older is a child that we diagnose, the more likely we are to be facing with the results of autism, but not autism itself. And we know that because the median age, or the average age of the diagnosis of autism in this country is stubbornly stuck between the ages of 4 and 5 and several years more for those who come from low-income environments, from minority families or rural families. So we're basically waiting until our children are failing in school to diagnose them. And those things that we used to believe are part and parcel of autism are not. They are the results of autism, which basically tells us this: were we to be able to identify children early and to intervene early, not only that we might be able to optimize their outcomes, to make sure that they can go to an inclusive kindergarten and they have a greater opportunity to succeed in schools, but we also preempting some of those things that are most costly, such as the treatment for severe behaviors. And in our center, we probably have one of the best. I'm in awe of my colleagues. One of the best severe behavior units in the country, but it costs a fortune. It costs about $90,000 to basically treat children who are, endangering themselves or endangering others. So why do we need that? It's not good for the child. It's not good for the family. Certainly, it's not good for the taxpayer. Now, all that I'm telling you is not controversial. So the American Academy of Pediatrics has, in fact, began to issue best practice parameters for the management of infants and toddlers and young children back in 2007. And they say that we need to screen children for developmental abilities, including autism, beginning at the age of 9 months, but certainly between the ages of 18 and 24 months. But somehow, we are not having the community uptake that we need because people don't realize what kind of responsibility is within our hands. So every day I go home thinking about the 66,000 children who are born every year who will have autism. And I'm thinking about all of those who are identified early and provided with services early and whose life is going to be different than those that are not. And so we have this awesome opportunity to really change the life course of individuals. But society is not quite catching up to that. And for those of you who are educators, people who work in schools, you should remember that only about 1 in 5 of the children who receive special education services in schools, only 1 in 5, is identified as having a problem before the age of 3. So once again, we as a society, we wait until things get really bad so that then we begin to serve. And then, of course, everything is more difficult and certainly more costly. So remember that. Now, again, going back to my early years, there was the sense that, number one, autism is inevitable, and the outcomes in autism, the negative outcomes of autism, are also inevitable. It's the brain, isn't it? It's also a genetic condition. It's the most strongly genetic of all neurodevelopmental conditions. But what does that mean? So I'll give you a sense of how strongly genetic it is. If I am a parent, if I'm a mother, and I have a child with autism, and I'm now pregnant, and I'm going to have another child, 1 in 5 of the younger siblings will also have autism, and 1 in 5, another 1 in 5, is going to have something that is kind of similar to autism or has some kind of developmental challenge. So maybe 2 in 5 of the younger siblings will have something that is related to this trait called autism. And so this is one. And so one would think, okay, so if it is genetic, as we know, it's the most strongly genetic of all conditions, it means that it's determined, it's done, isn't it? Just like, for example, you cannot change the color of your eyes. It's genetic, isn't it? But here is the truth about the connection between genetics and the condition itself. A tiny minority of people with autism, by tiny I mean tiny, has a genetic condition that I can put a finger on top of a gene, one gene, okay? For the vast majority, there are hundreds and hundreds of genes involved. That's number one. So it's very complex genetically. So the notion that we're going to have a genetic diagnosis of autism soon, it's kind of complicated because I'm not seeing this happen quite as yet. That's one. Second, it's very important for people when you think genetics that you think that those genes, they don't necessarily sort of switch on and off a particular behavior. And they certainly do not code for symptoms. Because genes are there to create proteins that are going to build your brain, and your brain is going to put you in the world, and you're going to experience things in the world and so forth. But the fact is that that genetic liability that our children are born with is something that is going to disrupt normative development. I mean, the normal development, but is not necessarily tied up with a particular symptom of autism. The people who have tried to do so have found very little. So this is a model that is rather different because it defines autism differently. Certainly, there is a genetic liability, okay? Now, that genetic liability is going to disrupt whatever it takes for every baby in this world to come in, interact with others, and develop the ability to talk, to acquire language, and to communicate with others, and to relate with others, and to learn about the world, and so forth. It disrupts that. Now, we don't see the symptoms of autism in the first year of life. The emergence of symptoms is only in the second year of life. And we can reliably diagnose children by the time that they are, truly about 24 months of age, or 24 to 36 months of age. Does that begin that autism begins there? No, it does not. Because what we see as autism is the result of the disruption of normative development. And so what this model tells us is that, if I want to identify children with autism very early on, I don't necessarily need to wait until the children are showing symptoms. I could measure the thing that makes possible for them to relate with others. And disruptions thereof become predictors of autism. So a lot of the research that I'm going to show you today has to do with that. And so rather than waiting until the age of 3, when the children are already on a path of autism, if I were able to measure what makes us socially interactive, I will be able to take that and move all the way back to when the first deviations occur. Okay? So think about that. It gives us also a tremendous opportunity. Because if I am able to identify those risk markers even before the children are showing the signs of autism, maybe I can also modify it much prior to the time in which the more symptomatic behavior becomes entrenched. Because our children, early on, they may not be learning about people, but they are learning about the world that interests them. And as they learn about the world, they become more and more entrenched into their autism. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So here are 3 concepts that I need you to sort of take it from my talk today, okay? And by the way, this is a thinking, hopefully, a thinking participatory talk. What does that mean? It means that I'm not going to give you a list of specific interventions. I'm going to talk about one in particular, but I'm not going to give you a list of a to-do list. What I would love for you to do today is to listen to what I'm saying, to see what I'm showing, and think about how does that map onto your understanding of the work that you do, and then ask me questions, okay? But from the standpoint of early brain development, there are 3 things that you need to remember. Number 1, we are born to interact. There is a reason for that. because God or nature needed to do something about babies, because babies are born in such an utter state of fragility. If they were not looked after by others, they would die. And therefore, from the moment that they are born, they are signaling to others, here I am, okay? So very foundational mechanisms of socialization are basically part of what we're born with. Second, what moves early brain development forward, social communication forward, is basically the reciprocal interaction between two human beings, between that baby and the caregiver. What does that mean? It means that if I park a child in front of a television and the television is speaking Chinese, that child ain't going to learn Chinese. The experiment was done. And so, no. So in order for a child to learn, there has to be somebody on the other side that is actively engaging them. And it is this back and forth that forms the platform for social communication. It gives you a sense of what kind of interventions you need to put in place. And number three, when we are born, our brains, they are fully formed, but they are a little spaghetti style. What does that mean? It means that by the time that we celebrate the first birthday of our babies, our brains have doubled in size, and synaptic density, which is the amount of organization, of complexity that has resulted from all of those experiences in the first year, has quadrupled. This is the period of greatest change in our brains in our lifetime, okay? Now, neuroplasticity means that not only that the brain is changing a lot, the brain is absorbing a lot. And a lot of those early experiences are actually becoming brain structure and brain connections. So I'm not going to show you this today, but my colleagues and I have been working with human infants in the first 6 months of life and with infant monkeys in their first 6 months of life. And we are able nowadays to look at how behaviors that we're observing when a baby is like 100 days of life is actually connected with white matter, which is like the connectivity sort of structure of the brain, how brain matter is maturing at the age of 180 days. So this is how, so we tend to believe that when we talk about brain, there is some kind of a black box over there that is dissociated from behavior. Behavior and brain are one and the same. We behave because we have a brain, and our brains become who we are because of our behaviors and experiences. Does that make sense to you? But do you understand what importance this is? Because at one point in time, that plasticity of the brain is going to diminish. Among all the animals that you can possibly think, we have this thing called neoteny, which is, it takes us a long time not to be babies anymore. So the development of the brain is protracted. There is a reason why God and nature created that. It's because it gives us time to learn a lot. And we see that even if we compare fairly close species, like, for example, human infants and infant monkeys, because infant monkeys do everything, almost everything that we do, but they do 4 times as fast. 4 times as fast, okay? So basically, they get set much earlier age than we do, okay? Now, there are some kind of constructs that I need you to get to me and to get with me. I do a lot of training. I train clinical psychologists. I train child psychiatrists and all that. And some of those constructs is important for a clinician, but I need you to get it, okay? There was this guy, Jacob von Uskal. You don't need to remember his name. But he spent a lot of time trying to see how this thing out there called the world looks like from the perspective of different animals. So you can see that, you walk into a garden, you're a human being, you're very poetic, you're going to see this beautiful, beautiful garden. If you're a butterfly, you are in a different zone, because all that you see are blurs of colors, and the red blurs are particularly important because they mean what? They mean food. So we know that because we have different visual systems and different brains, different species are going to create the world differently. So why is it so difficult for people to understand that that happens with children too? Which basically means that among all humans, We all have different experiences, and we will be creating the world differently if we come into this world with some vulnerabilities and if our experiences are different. So clinicians need to take the perspective of whomever we are working with, okay? So that's one thing. The other thing is that we are born with some biases. There is a reason why we have these biases. It's because we need to be social beings, because we need to survive. So here is just one little thing. We in this world, we anthropomorphize everything. Okay? So cars have personalities, I mean, you name it, okay? We turn objects, we turn things that are undefined into things that somehow deal with people. So, you know, years and years ago, maybe thousands of years ago, people look up and sort of to the heavens, and they saw these amazing stars, right? Great. But what did they see? They saw this kind of stuff. Now, I know this is not a human being, but this is part of a human experience. So they could take something that was out there, like stars, and translate it into something that was meaningful to their experience. Okay? So think about that. Now, many, many years ago, I was trying to capitalize on this tendency to anthropomorphize and try to get a sense if I could get a nice experiment going on. And so we built this computer head that you're seeing here. We called him Ezra at the time. And this is my daughter. She is now, she is a rising sophomore in college. But this is when she was little. She was turning almost 3. And we are a bilingual family, so she knew very little English at the time. She was just starting to go to daycare. But I basically brought her into the lab. I put this little computer head in front of her, and I programmed this computer head, and I just wanted to know what would she do? Would she treat it as an object? Would she treat it as some kind of a toy, or what?
Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! You hear me? I need to talk with you. Are you waking up?
Oh, somebody's here.
You know, listen for me. So,
Mom?
I got a mom. I got
Oh, it's you. Ha ha
I see. Are you silly about
ha. Hi.
you?
Ha ha
No, because you're like that.
ha. How are you?
Good.
Oh, my headaches. Oh, my tummy.
So she's anxious there. Now, there are any speech language pathologists in the room? Excellent. So, okay. So why is she getting so mad and so anxious? It's because when I was programming the thing, I didn't know the timing of the thing. But this computer head is basically breaking every single convention of contingency. Because when I am speaking with somebody, I speak, you speak, I speak, you speak, and somehow it relates. And what you have is this one-sided program that I wrote, and it was going on. And this is not quite 3-year-old who's getting mad at this thing because it's breaking all the conventions. And so it's no longer a computer head, it's basically a conversational partner, and a very bad one at that. But this is the level in the kind of the biology of social synchronies that basically we're talking about, okay? Now, where does that come from? Where did that emerge? So this is a baby. This is a monkey. Now, nothing shapes our brains more strongly than sociality, the fact that we need to live together. So what is the platform for the development of the brain of the infant monkey? That's where they are developing, right? Okay. Actually, I learned, for example, that because we study monkeys, that we kind of like to look at people and smile. You know what monkeys do? They lip smack, and it's exactly the same, but they lip smack. And so that's what they do when they want to interact with others. Now, what is the battleground for the development of human infants? So this is where our children are learning about people's communication, people's intentions, people's emotions, the way that you solve conflicts or fail to solve conflicts and so forth. But that's a battleground. That's what the brain needs in order to move forward. Okay? And one critical thing that we have learned over the years, and this really comes from one of the most wonderful neuroscientists in the field, is this notion that brain not only determines who we're going to be. We used to believe that we're born at this our coding genes, they program the brain, and the brain basically, you know what the person is going to be in the future. And what we found out is that the brain not only determines who we're going to be, the brain also becomes who we are. And in fact, the brain structures and function of our brain, okay? So the structure and functions are sculpted by those experiences. So remember that, okay? All right. So those are the sort of the primary constructs, okay? And I think that what I would like to do, I'd like to sort of start now with talking about young adults, okay? I'd like to talk about young adults because as a clinician, I've been puzzled over the years, particularly now that we know that only 36% of individuals with autism have intellectual disability, so most do not. I've been seeing individuals who are not intellectually disabled for a long time. Some of them were extraordinary, quite extraordinary, and yet, they couldn't do some stuff that I just couldn't believe it. Because this is something that, infants and toddlers do so well. And so I've been puzzled. So let me first ground you. Why I want to talk about infants and toddlers today is because we've been puzzled for many years on how come we have this enormous disparity in our children, adolescents, and adults profiles. There's some things they can do extremely well and some things they just can't do it. That's very important for us. Because as educators and as clinicians, the things that they can't do are usually the things that get them into trouble, right? So let's sort of move forward in time a little bit. Before that, however, I need to make sure that everybody's awake, and if anybody has a question, this is the time to ask me. Sir.
Over the past 5 or 6 years, there have been several discoveries, neurological discoveries, into the neurological mechanisms of action of autism. One of the most recent one was the defect in what are loosely called mirror neurons, where autistic individuals that produce the effect of a lack of empathy and, most importantly, the inability to observe and imitate to a greater or lesser extent, and also the lack of internal reinforcement, neurological, by a dopamine that in typical individuals is constantly rewarding virtuous behaviors and is to a greater or lesser extent absent in autistic individuals. So that autistic individuals lack internal reinforcement and the ability to learn by observation. And it looks like what we're doing in ABA is using direct instruction to overcome the inability to observe and imitate it, and also overcoming the lack of internal reinforcement with external reinforcement like M&Ms, Skittles.
And you'd like me to comment, because there are three very large pieces there. So first, let's talk about the mirror neuron research. So this research was basically an Italian primatologist, really, discovered this notion that when he was observing the monkeys that he was working with, whenever the monkey sort of imitated something that he did, so for example, something very simple, like bringing something to the mouth, if the monkeys did that, he had implanted some electrodes in some parts of the brain, and he found out that that piece of the brain or that circuitry would light up in a way you could actually hear it going. And so the notion here is that he had discovered this thing called the mirror neuron circuitry. There are something inside us that mirrors the behavior of the other. And because it's happening inside us, then we can have a sense of what does it feel like for the other. Okay? So this is the mirror neuron. And then people start doing research of that in autism, and they found out, in some cases, not in all cases, that circuitry was not working very well in individuals with autism. This is a prominent field of research. Having said that, there are some issues. And the issues are, like with almost everything in autism, that notion that I am mirroring somebody, that I'm actually imitating somebody, is something that children don't do very well. Imitation skills are part of truly almost defining criteria for autism, but not necessarily. And the reason not necessarily is because you can get individuals with autism to actually copy you. So I'm copying your gesture. And there is even something, people talk about echolalia quite a bit, which is when our children echo the sounds that others produce. But there is also the copy of gestures. So you can have individuals who go and say, hello, right? Hello. And or you can get them to do things that are exactly what you're doing. The question is, are they doing it for the same reason? They understand, are they using that imitative gesture as a way of accessing others? It is also the case that the vast majority of children with autism can actually copy. They can actually copy things. What they are not doing is imitating a function. I'll give you an example. My good friend many years ago, a guy called Peter Hobson, did this kind of study. He basically had he had a bit of a, I don't know, like a donut on this side, and he had like a rod on this side, and he showed the children how to put the rod inside the this donut. But this was done by basically a little machine, okay? A little machine. And then he did in another condition, he put 2 eyes on this machine. 2 eyes, just 2 eyes, okay? And the funny part was that the typical children only imitated when they had the eyes, whereas the children with autism did in both situations. And what he wanted to show is that they were copying the result of it, but they are not copying necessarily the agency of another. And then he did more. He went to the second condition. The second condition is when he just basically put the thing in, or he went on as if he was making an effort. The children with autism, they did the gesture just fine. They did nothing in regards to the agent making the effort, which basically means this happens in autism. Whenever people say that we have some kind of a symptom that describes everything, or a theory that describes everything, you realize that this world is divided into two. The world of things and the world of people. And our kids, they tend to do very well with the world of things, but not necessarily the world of people. So that's one of the main problems with the mirror neuron theory, because what the gentleman in Italy was showing was basically a copying gesture. And then people start basically building on that and build the entire empathy circuitry on top of that. So that's just one minor thing that I would say about that. The second question I think that you posed is reward. And indeed, reward is a big issue, and particularly self-reward. I do something because I want to do. And so when people say that children with autism don't have a reward system, it's a problem, because our kids actually will engage in some things like to the end of the world. It may be a repetitive movement, it may be a repetitive task, or it may be a subject that they are very interested in. They just don't engage with the things that we want them to engage with. And so it cannot be a generalized reward issue, because they certainly have a reward system that basically compensates them or recompensates them for behaviors that they do and they like. They just don't do that with people. And so that's one of the issues of the reward system, and we need to understand it. And there are particularly neurodevelopmental transition that happens very early in life, in fact between 4 and 12 weeks of age, in which children, they go from having reflexes, basically they just do things in the world because they are reflexes, to doing things in the world because they are responding to another. And needless to say, in order for them to respond to another, they need to be driven reward-wise to do so. So the reward system is a very important thing that we research, but there are issues that we need to understand. And the third question has to do with ABA. So we're all behaviorists, right? One way or another, whether you like it or not. Most of us are bad behaviors because everybody learns somehow through associations and so forth. One of the issues of ABA, however, is that, and it can be life-saving, ABA. I told you that I work in residential placements, and sometimes if you don't shape the behavior of adult clients, they can do terrible things. They can walk out of where you are and they can run into a body of water, or they can run into a road, and so applied behavior analysis can be, treatment can be life-saving, really. I think the issue sometimes becomes when we believe that when we are training a child, for example, using discrete trial or using verbal behavior and so forth, that we are getting our children to do that behavior in the same way that typical children acquire that behavior. And it is often not the case, because we are basically teaching them something by rewards, by using your M&Ms, and you may get the behavior. Whether you get the functionality or the flexibility of the behavior, that's something very different. And so I think that for children, for example, who are 4 and 5, and they are not speaking, and they are at risk of never speaking in their lives, I think that applied behavior analysis, verbal behavior, and so forth is the way to go, because at this point in time, we need to get things going, right? But I wouldn't, for example, use, say, discrete trial with an 18-month-older. And I wouldn't do that because that child is capable still of learning, in a way, how to learn. So that by learning, by normalizing a little bit more the way that the child is learning, maybe that learning becomes the tool and not the specific behavior that I am targeting. Does that make sense? Okay. I was a little verbose here. But 3 very interesting questions. So let's go. I told you about adults, right? So back in 1943, this gentleman, Leo Kanner, the father of child psychiatry in this country, he described the 11 children, and that was the original description of autism. And the fact is that the description of autism hasn't changed much since Leo Kanner. It is still the case that is first and foremost a social disability, and our kids, they tend to be engaged in sort of in repetitive, restricted patterns of interest. They do the same thing over, they dislike change and so forth. So in many different ways, that description of autism remains very much the same. Okay? Here are the things that we're learning, that we learned since 1943, okay? And this is my first test. You won't be able to get your credit if you don't get this right, okay? So this is a picture of a school in New Haven, Connecticut in the 1960s. There is one person here who does not have autism. Who is that person? Yeah, that was easy, right? Now, that's the way that autism was, and even at the time that I was training, this is what autism... So people basically were entirely isolated. So you see the young man who's turned to the side, one is tapping the water repeatedly, the other one is looking at the lights, and the other one is self-stimulating and so forth, and you see the staff members trying to reach others. So this was the notion that in autism, people were extraordinarily aloof and isolated, okay? And so these are the kind of folks that I remember working with. This lady, for example. So she used to spend all of the time reading books. And she would read those books. She was able to translate those graphemes into sounds. She didn't understand what she read. And she was isolated, and she would do that all day if they left. Now, those kinds of challenges are not relegated yet to the dustbin of history, but we're seeing that autism is a much broader spectrum. But this is, for example, a videotape of the treatment of an 11-year-old who was about 6 foot tall, and he was 220 pounds or 240 pounds at the time. And he didn't sit down on chairs, and he wouldn't go into a school bus, and he was the only thing he wanted to do throughout his day was basically play in his iPad, and if somebody removed the iPad, he would spit or he would hit and those sort of things. So this child, when he came to us, he was on his way to being institutionalized, because the parents couldn't keep him at home. He was the danger to the younger sibling and whatnot. Okay, but this is still the sort of the autism of the 1940s and 1950s. You know, it creates a problem for the live stream because I don't want this to be sort of like a repository in the so I'm gonna stop. But here's what's happening. You saw that the young man was wearing protecting gear, right? He was wearing protecting gear because this boy would spit and he would hit really, really hard. So we have a lot of injuries in our severe behavior units every month. These young people work very, very, very hard. But here the issue is that it was possible over the course of about 4 to 6 months to basically train this guy to sit on a chair, to follow adult lead, and then we transition him into our own school. We have our own school, and we transition him there, and eventually we transition him back into the home. We transition him into school, and he could sort of do work and all these sort of things. But this is the way that autism was. Okay? Yes, for some children this is this. But if you want to get a sense, you want to take my perspective, and I look at this boy, let's call him Nathan. You know, I'm not sure that that's necessary. I'm not sure that all of these challenges that he's showing would be there were we sort of been able to identify this very early. Because the reason why he is so frustrated with the world is that he is nonverbal. He has no way of communicating his needs. He doesn't understand why he needs other people. He doesn't understand why he needs to sit down. All this kind of stuff. Okay? Now, what we've learned over the years is that autism is also a collection of extraordinary abilities. And I can tell you, now I'm not going to do that, but I used to do day-long workshops in which I would spend most of the time talking about higher functioning individuals. Say, gosh, you know, there are amazing things that our folks can do. This one, again, if you can. So this young man was a research assistant working in our team at Yale for 4 years. He's a Yale graduate in psychology and computer science. His name is Mark. And Mark is actually the guy who coined the term neurotypical. and Mark is one of the brightest people I've ever met. Okay? So Mark was working with us, and I was just seeing this 16-year-old, also extremely bright, let's call him Robert. And Robert was really interested in math, in algebraic equations. So this is the thing that he was really interested in. But he was an enormously bright guy. So I saw them together, and he could do a whole bunch of equations that I couldn't understand, but I knew that Mark could. And so I basically introduced them, and I left the room, okay? Speech language pathologists among you, what is going on here? Do you understand what they're talking about? Are they building on each other's and so forth? So basically what Robert was talking about is number encryption. And the way that people sort of encrypt your credit card numbers and so forth, and for that you need prime numbers, and for that you need equations and stuff like that. But this guy was bright. Okay? He certainly knew what he was talking about. The only problem is that when they got together, it's like two ships in the dark. Because there isn't a conversation. Each one is talking about what's going on in the head. They are both extraordinarily bright, but a conversation, this ain't. And so this notion is that, my God, there is a huge spectrum in autism, okay? And so what brings them all together? And those are the kinds of challenges that we have seen in adolescents and adults with autism, regardless of their level of IQ. You know, the social skills, everything that has to do with the intangibles, the unstructured, the novel, the implicit, the intuitive, everything that is common sense, our folks simply don't have a sense of common sense. Everything that has to do with the mind, right, mentalistic, the intentions, the emotions, the beliefs, the false beliefs. In terms of communications, everything that is informal, conversational, reciprocal, polite, all of this kind of stuff is extremely hard. And that translates into real life skill deficits and tremendous limitations in independent living. And there are ways that they're learning about the world. You know, they tend to learn about the world in a rote manner, in a sequential manner. Unfortunately, the world is conceptual, and the world is also integrative. There are a whole bunch of things that all of our folks do, and all of those things puzzled me. Because many of our folks could do things that, the typical peers couldn't do. But they had a very specific profile, and that's what defines sort of autism. And I was trying to understand that. So I'm only going to pluck out here just the social issues, okay? So here are some examples to you. You probably know that if I talk to somebody like Mark or Robert on a one-on-one basis, we're going to have the most amazing conversation, provided I'm talking about what they want to talk about, right? They don't necessarily want to talk about what I want to talk about, but, we can adjust very quickly. But if you are an educator, you know that the problem is really at that moment that they walk into that school. And when, there is no rules and regulations, there is no expectations, there is no specific recipe to follow, and they need to find what is important in the world. And therefore, rather than just basically imposing structure, what we're really trying to understand is what would happen if they had to impose their structure on that world. And so here is what happens. Here I am interviewing Robert now. He was very, very depressed at the time that I saw him, and I had observed him at school. And he said that if he ever found out that he would never have a girlfriend, that he would kill himself. And I was extremely worried about, because, we think about individuals of autism as totally isolated, right, and aloof and so forth. For most of our folks, they are not isolated by choice. They're isolated by this repeated experiences of failure. But here, I wanted to make sure that I understood what went on, because he was into real trouble at the time, and there were lawsuits against his family in the school district, so I was trying to understand. So you have a guy who is brighter than you or I, okay? And what does he do? He basically roams the high school cafeteria, and then he finds somebody that he likes, and he stares, and then he says what's in his mind. And so basically, I had to tell the school, by the way, guys, you understand that there are a lot of boys thinking about those things. He's not the only one. But you know what is the difference? Is that he says it. And for him, there is no border between the public and the private. And he's not aware that, yes, it's true, but you will get in trouble if you say that, and speaking is actually an action. So if you really want to place yourself in his position, we can do a little bit of a dynamic here. We can have a little group dynamic. And I'm going to ask everybody to tell me their innermost fantasies, okay? So starting with the gentleman on the first row. Now, why you're laughing? Well, you're laughing because maybe you don't want to share your innermost fantasies, maybe because you are clearly aware that the moment that you do so, people are going to think something about you. Do you want to share the feelings you have about me right now? All the hatred and stuff? I mean, no, right? And we don't do that because there are social mores. There are things that we do and there are things that we don't. And I look at Robert and I will think, my God, you know, how can somebody has this level of cognitive sophistication, okay, and yet does not understand something that maybe a kindergarten would know. I mean, a kindergarten can lie, right? But Robert is not a good liar. In fact, our kids and adolescents and adults are really truthful to a fault. They say what's in their minds and they get themselves in trouble. And then I was trying to understand, because he went on to say to me that if he found out that he wouldn't have a girlfriend, he would kill himself. You know, a clinician that I am, I'm asking him, how will you find out that you'll never have a girlfriend? After all, I mean, we can't find out those sort of things. And that's how. So he would come up with algebraic equations. He would assign letters to people's emotions, and he would try to solve those algebraic equations. And God forbid one day he had a QED, because he'll be in real danger. Now, I look at him and I'm thinking, oh my God, you know, doesn't he have an intuition that algebraic equations have nothing to do with people's feelings and experiences? That this is the way that he is actually conceiving of how to navigate the social world? Okay, puzzlement. And then, again, let me just cut. And that's the last one, the penultimate time that you viewed. So then I asked his mom, tell me, what was it like to raise this guy? That it's basically, she's speaking a different language that he doesn't understand. It's the mentalistic language, it's the social language, it's the language of conventions. It's everything that you don't teach in schools, but kids somehow absorb, but he didn't, okay? So let's do a test now, okay? Once again, I'm testing you. How many people have seen this animation before? Okay, so don't tell others, okay? It's a classic animation, 1944. It's just a cartoon, okay? So don't be too afraid. And it's a cartoon that has two triangles, a circle. There are some lines. Oh no. Yeah. Yay. So the notion here is that whatever you're seeing here, it's only in your mind, because these are basically just shapes. But they are moving in a certain way that immediately you do the anthropomorphizing that I'm telling you about. So I remember showing this to typically developing adolescents, and this is kind of will be an illustrative narrative. What happened was that the larger triangle, which was like a bigger kid or a bully, and had isolated himself from everything else until two new kids come along, and the little one was a bit more shy and scared, and the small triangle like stood up for himself and protected the little one. The big triangle got jealous of them, came out, started to pick on the smaller triangle. The little triangle got upset and said like, "What's up? Why you're doing this?" This adolescent was on drugs. No, he was not on drugs. He was basically forgot that these are geometric shapes and basically doing what we do, which is like we create a narrative. Now, I showed this typically to adolescents with autism, and this is a very bright adolescent with autism, and this is what he said. The big triangle went into the rectangle. There were a small triangle and a circle. The big triangle went out. The shapes bounced off each other. The small circle went inside the rectangle. The big triangle was in the box of the circle. The small triangle and the circle went around each other a few times. Up to here, it's only geometric shapes. But he knew I needed more, so he went on to say they were kind of oscillating around each other, maybe because of a magnetic field. And so imagine that you have social causation on one side, and you have sophisticated but physical causation on the other side. And that's basically just narratives, totally spontaneous. So in a way, people are looking at the same thing, but they are thinking about very different things indeed. Can you see that? So it was clear it was clear at the time to me that our folks were not thinking about others. So you see, I'm obsessed about the way that you're feeling about me, because I know that you're judging me every second that I'm here, right? So I'm looking at your eyes. I understand that you have some feelings, thoughts, so forth. And so I'm looking at you. Even the people there at the last row. I'm thinking, what are they doing? Why are they? So she just squinted a little bit. So maybe that means. So I'm obsessed about people. We're all obsessed about people. Not so our folks. Not so our folks. And so the question that I had is that what happens in school? So they go into that classroom, and if they're thinking about magnetic fields, they ain't understanding what is happening in that classroom. You understand? So that was the notion. Now, I'm aware that, we think about people, but we also look at people, right? So, and there is a sense that sometimes when we look at people, do you have a sense of what I'm doing right now? Yeah, so I'm looking at you, I'm thinking about you, right? It works all the time. Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Does it work? Yeah. So it works because looking at means thinking about. So the question that I had then is just, so if they're not thinking about people all the time, then are they looking at people? Meaning, can we actually stand behind a person's eyes and see what they are looking at? And so using eye tracking technology, we could. And of course, because I'm a big fan of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton and Edgar Albee, so this was the first study that we did with adults. And this is the adult that I told you who has an MPH from Yale. I didn't tell him about him. It's somebody that I saw for many years. So a very smart guy, with autism. I was followed in our center for forever. And so he is the black cross that you see here. Can you see a black cross? Okay, so here's a black cross. And then there is a typical adult, and here's the white cross. And I showed them sort of this great movie called Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which is a wonderful play, and it was the Oscar of 1966, and most of you don't know about it. But anyway, so that it is. So I was showing scenes of this movie, and this is what I got. Try to follow what they are doing as they are watching this movie. It's too fast. That's, okay, slow motion for you then, but that's the speed of social interaction. So you saw what happened? So this is basically what happened. Richard Burton smashes the bottle, and then there's a cut to the young couple who are facing them. And what you see there, on your top right, is what the typical adult did. He went straight to the young man's eyes, because that's where that's where he thought it's going on. Now, the individual with autism went alongside the face and rested on his mouth. He was waiting for the guy to say something so that he could understand what had happened. Now, do me a favor here. So let me see if I manage to get. I can't get the pointer here. So focus on the panel on your left, okay? And then just cover the half of the young man's face and tell me where his emotion is. It's over here or over here. Is the top of his face or the bottom of his face? Okay, so some people are very lazy today, so here we go. So most of that expression is actually in the eyes, because the mouth is pretty expressionless. So my friend with autism, just basically in that momentary experience of social of a social occurrence miss the entire meaning of that thing. Now, this is another thing. Let me tell you that Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton are a couple, and the young man and the young woman are a couple, okay? And Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton they love each other, and they scratch each other, and they are doing things, and everybody here is drunk, okay? And so what has happened is that Elizabeth Taylor is actually flirting with the young man, and her husband is right behind. And so what you see at the top in that triangle is a typical adult watching this scene. And he basically goes back and forth, but he's checking the reaction of the husband, because the meaning of that scene is the reaction of the husband. Is he, what is he going to do? I mean, she's flirting right in front of him. Whereas the bottom, I think it's green, is the adult with autism. So he is basically focusing on what the young man is saying, and then goes and says, well, nice cup, and then, nice bits of Elizabeth Taylor. But entirely missing the meaning of that interaction. Can you see? And this is momentary stuff. Now, that happens all the time. Okay? So, are those social misses there of importance for kids? Well, kind of yes, because those social things, they translate into independent living deficits, the so-called adaptive skills. Because they don't know the social mores, because they are not aware of others, because they are not monitoring themselves relative to others, they have troubles with grooming, self-care, domestic chore, survival skills, living in a community, functioning in bureaucracy. I mean, you name it. I can tell you, all of this are lists of the kinds of issues that even the brightest among individuals with autism have difficulty with, because they are all basically social skills in one way or another. Understanding how to behave in different situations, understanding what are the conventions, understanding what are the expectations of others. When we think about how our folks behave with the police, when we know how they behave, for example, with folks who are trying to sell them things, and telemarketers and whatnot, how many times I had to intervene because our folks got themselves in trouble. All of those sort of things are really, really, really what life is about. And yet all springs from that sense that they're not learning in action. They are not learning about how to survive in this world. And so the kinds of questions that we've been having is, gosh, from when? So in terms of their learning skills, you probably know, that a lot of individuals who are higher functioning have this circumscribed interests. And those things can lead to tremendous communication breakdown if all that people want to think about and learn about and talk about is their own circumscribed interests. And that creates, I can give you examples from today to the end of the world, but I've had, conversations with kids about snakes, about religion, about cul-de-sacs, about deep fat fryers, about Shakespeare's plays, telephone pole insulators, Digimon, weather, you name it. They simply focus, but it's much more than that. They end up understanding their world on the basis of their circumscribed interests. So I remember, for example, that our folks would bring those interests to their surfing on the internet. So they may like explosions, or they may like bombs, but then they go on the internet. And the moment that you start searching for how to make a bomb on the internet, I promise you, somebody's going to be knocking on your door. So somebody's going to be knocking on your door. And so there are tremendous, tremendous challenges that our folks, and we tend to minimize the importance of those things. The internet is a social environment. And many of our adults, they are cavemen, and they are in their rooms, and they are doing all these things on the internet, thinking that they are doing that in private, except that they aren't. Absolutely they aren't. How many legal cases? There are 2 books written about those sort of things already that I facilitated. just because our folks get themselves in trouble, because they go and they're looking at images and then they are downloading those images and they don't know even what they're downloading, and they also download malware, and this malware is installed there maybe by the state police, maybe by the federal police, and then they get themselves in trouble, and there are statutory sort of sentences for many of those kinds of things. So I tell folks that, you know, internet is a social environment, and it's open to the world. And we need to make sure that our folks don't fall prey to that. The other piece that it was really interesting to me as work of adults, adolescents and adults, is that we shouldn't minimize the importance of those circumscribed interests. I remember one boy, for example, who came to us and he was quite depressed. But all that he wanted to talk about was cul-de-sacs. So he was an expert on cul-de-sacs. And guess what? They were all, he lived in a cul-de-sac, that was his identity, and they're opening the street. And so he would no longer live in a cul-de-sac. And that was devastating to him. It'll be a little bit for me to tell you, you raised your hand when I said speech and language pathologist, so I assume that that's very much part of your identity. And tomorrow I'm telling you, you're no longer a speech and language pathologist. I think you'll be devastated. So was my client there. And so just imagine, we tend to build our self-identity and our self-concept on the basis of the way that we are in the world. But for many of our folks, they are using those processes of circumscribed interest to build their understanding of themselves and of others. I could go on for a long time, but I think you get things, you get what I'm saying. But can you understand then, at this point in time, why I became fixated on infants and toddlers? Because we needed to understand, where does that come from? Those are severe, entrenched challenges that we all, as clinicians, as educators, as parents, as advocates, we all need to deal with. And I needed to understand, how can you have, for many of our kids, this extraordinary abilities, but like islands around the sea of disability. And the disability rested always in the social domain. Okay? So now I'm going to take you back in time, but before I do that, there are questions, and it seems like you have one.
Yeah, since you identified the deficit in the autistic individual attending to the mouth or the furniture instead of the eyes, and what the different expressions and emotions are expressed in eyes, can't you directly instruct an individual over time to start looking at eyes and identifying the emotions that are found in eyes, and therefore become more typical instead of atypical and socially stigmatized?
Yeah, that's in some ways what we do in this thing called social skills training. In social skills training, we basically use the rules and regulations of social interaction to teach people in a very, 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 very precise, rote, sequential way those rules, and we expect them that they will follow, and they often do. Okay? But here is the catch. Okay? So here is the catch. The catch is a little bit like, say, I don't know about you, but I have a 15-year-old, and he just got his permit. So imagine if I went to him and say, here is the book on how to drive a car, and I expect him tomorrow morning to drive the car. Guess what? He ain't going to be able to drive the car, even though he has all the theory in his mind. And the notion is that some things in life you basically learn in action. And so there is a whole realm of neuroscience called embodied cognition. And embodied cognition has to do with the fact that there are a lot of things that are reposited in our body, basically knowledge about the world, skills, that they are in the body. And what do I mean by in the body? Is that we do things and we don't think about them. So we drive without thinking, we play tennis without thinking, we go back a flight of stairs without thinking, we do a whole bunch of things because they become internalized. And we do those sort of things because we internalize this as something that is habitual. And social interaction is habitual. So the reasons I tell you this is because our folks, they can learn a lot of things. They just don't learn how, they learn about the world more than they learn how to function in the world. A lot of that body of knowledge is theoretical. And so in many different ways to go from the theory, from the rule, to something that is displayed automatically and instinctively, which is what social needs to be like, becomes a problem. So I can tell you a bit. I wish. That's right. So the question then is, if we just repeat it, that's what we do. We repeat a lot. But then we often, I'm saying this is how social skills training is done. Okay? But then you need to know that there are limitations. And there are limitations because we're teaching them to do something in a way other than the way that other folks learn. So for example, when we publish studies on the fact that folks with autism tend not to look at the eyes, they focus more on the mouth, and they focus on the mouth primarily because they rely on explicit language to understand what is going on, people thought, so let's just teach people how to look in people in the eye. And guess what? They can look in the eye. And one wonderful adult wrote a book about it because he says, I now look at the eyes. Okay, so she felt uneasy because I was staring. Okay, and so do our folks. In many different ways, they can look at you in the eye just like anybody else. But does the eye mean this? The eyes mean the same thing to him as it means to others? Probably not, because when I'm doing eye gaze, eye contact with another, I mesh it. Because if I stared, I make people very uncomfortable. So you see what I mean? What I mean is that you can get the final behavior, just like we do with ABA as well. You can get the manifest behavior, but it will not be flexible, and you often get yourself in trouble. And I can sort of give you just one more example. My colleague Fred Volkmar at Yale was a much bigger man than I am in all directions, this way, okay? And so my friend Tom, who was the person with autism that I saw for many years, very smart guy, once saw Fred Volkmar at the Yale gym. And the Yale was terrible, the gym was terrible, so basically it was open showers. So everybody could see everybody in it, right? And so Tom, in no problem, approached Fred and said, Dr. Volkmar, you stand to lose quite a bit of weight. To which Fred said, that is true, Tom. But Tom, you can't say this because you get people. That's the reason why I come to the gym. Number one. Number two, you don't say those things. You can actually hurt people's feelings and so forth. No problem. Lesson learned. 2 weeks later, Tom saw Fred outside of the Child Study Center again, and once again he went, Dr. Volkmar, you still stand to lose quite a bit of weight. And then so Fred went to ask the question, Tom, come on. Nobody had told Tom that you don't say those things not only at the Yale gym, but nowhere else. And so when people tell me that our kids have difficulty generalizing, it's because they learn the rule. But they're learning that rule. And I think that most of us can write books about the extent to which our folks tend to concretize or be overly literal about those things. So there is no question answering your question that we can do those sort of things, but we need to do the generalization for them as well, which basically means that we need to teach the parents. And this wonderful lady called Lorna Wing, she had a daughter with autism, and she is one of the pioneers of autism research, once said that life is not long enough to teach all social skills in the world. Having said that, I'm in total agreement. We can teach all, the basic survival skills so that our folks can succeed in life. You had 2 more questions.
Were there any differences in eye tracking for individuals with autism who had theory of mind versus those who did not?
So that's an interesting question. Theory of mind. So theory of mind is our ability to attribute to others or to understand that their behavior is a function of things that are basically invisible. They happen in your mind and you can't see. Those things are intentions. Those things are emotions. These things are expectations, beliefs, false beliefs, and all these kind of things, right? So once again, I was trained in a place where theory of mind. So I was in Medical Research Council. My colleague Ute Frith was doing this research. My good friend Simon Baron-Cohen. They all sort of, Simon likes to say that children with autism or individuals with autism are mind blind. So, but if they just can attribute to other people intentions and so forth, then everything will be fine. So that guy, Mark Ramoser, that I just showed you, in the very first book on theory of mind, I wrote a chapter. And I decided to ask Mark to write the preamble for that chapter. And so Mark wrote the preamble. I've been accused of not having a theory of mind. I've been accused of not understanding that other people have this and this. I mean, an essay on it. He knew everything about theory of mind and about minds and about this kind of a thing set. And then after sort of finishing that, I watch him in the hall. And this is a clinical environment. And he was pacing back and forth talking to himself. Talking to himself and saying things, you know, they shouldn't be heard. So he was entirely blind to the fact that somebody could hear him and they were observing him. So he had all of the theory of mind in the world. If by theory of mind you mean solving a problem. Now what he didn't have is a theory of mind in action, which is basically that sense that you are integrating that knowledge into your actions. And in so many different ways, the answer is no. The answer is no. In fact, the individuals who have more language, because theory of mind to some extent is mediated by language, they were more likely to be entirely reliant on what the person said. Now you understand that life is, for the speech language pathologists, again, for the communication specialists among you, life is cruel because we say things that we don't mean. And we mean things that we don't say. And the only way that I know that is that I take what you say and I contextualize. How do I contextualize? I'm looking at your facial gestures. I'm looking at your tone of voice. I'm listening to your tone of voice. I am looking at your body movements, and I'm looking at the reactions of the others, and I create context. All that you focus is, so you wouldn't understand Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf by simply look. See what I mean? So that's the issue. The issue is that people tended to conceptualize theory of mind as something that you're born with. Almost. It emerges, it develops by the time you're 4, you can make attributions of beliefs and false beliefs to others. But this is not it's not a condition for social action. It's basically, it results from those years of social action. That's what I'm saying. And individuals with autism can be taught theory of mind. It's actually, again, social skills training. We teach, all those sort of things. Whether they become instinctive, intuitive, immediate, that's the big question that we have. I have a final question that I'm going to move on.
It's really another question. I'm just making the connection. For the behaviors, inappropriate behaviors, we used to look for the what. Now we are looking for the why. And we are getting much faster result and then solving the problem behaviors. Similar to what it
like
was.
Like in functional behavior assessment.
Correct. And also we were looking for the children or the adults in the spectrum, teaching them the skills like you show the eye, how the tracing with the eye is, how individual with ASD looking for the mouth rather than to the eye. We can teach that. To look, I mean, we have the wonderful science behind us, ABA, to teach that. But teaching that component is not necessarily going to teach the function while looking at the eye rather than the mouth piece. Like you give the example of the reading a book. They can read the book. I had a child in the spectrum, one of my clients will come to school every morning with the New York Times book review in his hand. He would read no problem, but had no understanding of it. Going to the function, should we focus on more to the generalized imitation? And should we focus more like the equivalence classes to teach those components, the basics, rather than just...
Yeah, I think, number one, you teach depending on the profile of a child. Correct. So it depends, level of ability, level of communication skills, level of understanding of the world, because there is a huge spectrum, right? And then you focus on the priorities that are going to make possible for that child to adjust to the world more successfully, because you want the child to succeed. And so it depends on the skill. For example, computer skills or internet skills. I told parents very literally, you go and you say that what you are doing is being observed by others, which basically means don't. Okay? I say don't. Okay, so that might take care of it, and you get rule. And even if he doesn't understand why, I don't care. I don't want him to download illegal pictures. Okay, so don't. Now, when we are teaching social communication skills and so forth along the lines of what you're saying, it depends. But we first start with the explicit, and we first start with the repetitive, but we can't stop there. That's what I'm saying. You're going to be extraordinarily frustrated when you're observing this young guy in the real world, in the natural world, that he's not doing what you taught him to do. And so what I'm saying is, just like driving, embodied cognition is something that tells us that in order for something to become more functional, it needs to be absorbed. And that thing does not end with solving a problem. That's why I mentioned the answer to the theory of mind question. In theory of mind, there is the sense that we abstracted what are the rules for taking the perspective of the other. Okay? But some of my folks can abstract. They can solve those problems. They still don't do it in real life because they are not worried about people. And so we need to do that too. And in social skills training, we do that kind of a thing. I'll have a final comment, and then can I just have, so don't forget, because the young man wanted to have a question as well, and then I need to move on. Because
I was just wondering, I've come into contact with a lot of older folks and adolescents on the spectrum who either committing severe self-harm with like cutting behaviors, things like that, or suicidality, ideation, things like that. Besides acceptance commitment therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, things like that, are there any other resources specifically for bridging the counseling and the behavioral aspects together? Because it seems pretty limited at this point from what I'm seeing.
Well, mental health services for individuals with autism is a major crisis in this country, and the major concerns that we have are anxiety and depression, and suicidality is part of the story. In fact, there is a feature today in Simon's Foundation news about the fact that individuals with autism are probably a tenfold higher risk of suicidality than others. So what we say is that just like in the treatment of anxiety, you take something that is proven, like CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, but you adjust to autism. And there are a lot of wonderful people who have adjusted CBT, cognitive behavior therapies, to autism. That's one piece. And the second piece is that it needs to be part of also you need to take the perspective of the individual you're working on. Just like I mentioned Robert, right? When somebody tells you that he's going to kill himself if he doesn't have a girlfriend, you probably, the next thing that you're going to do is basically, medicate him or something like that. But here's the issue. I wanted to know what was the path of thinking that led into that conclusion. And then you can work with that. So what I'm saying to you is that everything that I've told you so far has to do with how individuals with autism have a special way of constructing the world, understanding the world, others and themselves. When parents ask me the question, how much does he understand about himself, right? Does he have a special understanding of himself? And the answer is he understands himself as much as he understands others. Because the way that we understand ourselves in exactly the same terminology that we use to describe ourselves, we describe others. Mm-hmm. And so they are just as puzzled by everything. And that kind of thinking goes for sexuality, it goes for puberty, it goes for a whole bunch of other things. So behavioral health services is a big topic. If you want to look into one piece of great research, the name is right here in Pennsylvania, Brenna Maddox, Maddox. She's a UPenn. She works with David Mandel, and fantastic resources on providing mental health services for adolescents and adults with autism that are community viable. Okay, guys. Now, I have counted your blinks, which basically means that when people are blinking a lot, it means that they're almost falling asleep. I'm now going to go into babies. Okay? But I'm going to be a little faster. But before I do that, I'm going to give you 8 minutes. Okay, I'm going to give you 8 minutes to basically stand up and do whatever you need to do. I'm going to step out too. Okay, so I'm not going to take questions as I'm walking out because I need to take 8 minutes as well. And then I'm coming back and we are banging this up. And then I want people who have not asked me questions, if they have questions, please do. But I have quite a bit to tell you still about infants and toddlers. Just do me a favor, don't go away. It's going to be very lonely if I'm here by myself. And now I'm talking about babies. It's 2:58, guys. So my hope is that now you're going to take the 2 sections that we discussed. The first one that I told you about some of the foundations of socialization. The second one is all of the challenges and questions that adolescents and adults bring up, and take the journey with me into their infancy and toddlerhood. Okay? The question that we had was those very interesting behaviors, those very interesting challenges that we are trying to treat and support solutions for, where do they come from? Okay? And for the past, I would say since 2004 or so, we have been following infants. From the time that they're born all the way to the time that they develop autism. Not only us, but many other groups in the country and beyond. And so here are some of the lessons of our work. Okay? So take now a journey in time. Remember that before the questions, I was now taking you back in time in the lives of our children, adolescents, and adults. So this is how we're born. So babies are born in an utter state of fragility, okay? Now, they come into a world that is quite complex. There are lots of things around them, lots of things to pay attention to, right? A lot of things to become distracted by. But what is that infants see? This is what infants see, okay? They see people. And so anything that sounds like caregivers, they're attracted to. Anything that smells like caregivers, they're attracted to. Anything that moves like caregivers, they are attracted to. Anything that looks like caregivers, anything that interacts like caregivers. It's basically, there is a canalization of experiences. Imagine that in this big world, okay, that we could pay attention to a lot of things. I know that you're paying attention, hopefully, to me. And the reason is that I am relevant right now in this lecture room because I'm giving the lecture. But the same thing in the life of a baby. So there are basically genetically programmed, evolutionarily based mechanisms of socialization that are stimuli out there in the world that attracts our babies' sort of attention from very early on in life. Okay? So think about that. And remember that once they are signaling to others and they are basically engaging in a mutually reinforcing choreography. It's a dance that we all play from the first days and weeks of life. And remember what I told you, that the platform or the engine moving brain development forward is not simply a stimulus. Putting a baby in front of a TV ain't going to teach the child language. So what is needed really is that active agent on the other side, basically bringing the child in, and then there is the serve and return, in the words of Jack Shonkoff, that happens. Is a tennis match, is a tango, is reciprocal social interaction. Remember that, okay? Now, having said all that, okay, how foundational the things that I've mentioned to you, I would like you to take a look now at this child that I'm seeing a long time ago. At the time when we published, this child was the youngest child ever been diagnosed with autism. She was only 15 months of age. So if that's possible, I wouldn't like to, okay? So take a look and tell me what you see. I'm kind of 2 inches from her nose, but I'm not attracting her very much, am I? So is she blind? Is she deaf? She can hear, she can see. Well, 5 minutes later, she does this. Okay, so what she does is that she's not seeing me 2 inches from her nose, but she sees an M&M about 5 feet away from her. So apart from not making me feel very well, the question then is, what is the world that this child lives in? What does she think about? What does she see? And so the working hypothesis is that all of those foundational mechanisms of socialization the babies are born with, that she came in with an attenuated sense of the other. And that's a big issue, because for most babies, the thing on the top left is what they are concerned about. And for many of our children, they're concerned about things other. Like this boy, for example, he was from a school that I working with, his main thing was bottles of 7-Up, and he collected them. So imagine that if you are going to experience the world in the top line, you're going to become an expert on people. And your understanding, your theory of mind, your understanding of people is going to be ever more sophisticated. Now, if you start the world with an interest in objects, you may learn a great deal about objects, and it may be very sophisticated, but it's a different kind of expertise, okay? So just think about that. Now, this child really changed the way that we did research, because I was obsessed about the fact that I wanted to get into this child's mind. I wanted to understand what goes on inside that, okay? And one way of trying to get a sense of what she was thinking about was creating an experiment, all right? And because I couldn't just ask her the question, she was 15 months of age, she did not have language at the time, and so we developed this experiment, which is a classical paradigm in neuroscience. See what you see here. You see what's going on there? Okay, it may not have taken you that, so I see that you're very proud. But don't be so proud, because what those point lights are doing, they are moving in certain ways that basically are bringing out the templates that you have about human action. And the way that they are moving, that movement is called biological motion, which is basically something that we are all born with, which detects life. And don't feel too too proud, because babies do that. Human babies do that. Actually, monkeys do that. Cats do that. In fact, newly hatched chicks do that, and it's part of the imprinting mechanism. This is how foundational is our preferential attention to biological movement. Okay? So the experiment that we did was this. These are real people that we rendered as point light displays. On the left, you have the upright person, okay, and that person is going to try and reach a baby, okay? And what you have on the right-hand side is the same animation, but turned upside down and played backwards, okay? The idea is that if I'm eliciting the child's template of a human being approaching, typically it's going to be upright, right? And so the child is going to be looking at the upright figure. Is that okay? All right, so here we go.
Hi, Teddy. How are you doing? Yeah, Teddy.
So you got the experiment? Okay, good. So let's now take a look at the way that a typically developing 2-year-old would look at those stimuli. And the cross tells you where she's looking at, okay?
Johnny, it's time for dinner, Johnny. Time to eat some food. Ready? Here we go. Here comes the first bite. Want some? Here we go. Here comes another bite. Ready?
So what you're seeing is that child, you know, yes, there are point light displays, but she is basically looking at a social, almost like basically infant-directed speech, an adult approaching. And the fact that these are point lights, you know, it's secondary, because there is social causation. That biological motion is bringing up basically social behavior, okay? Now, this is what happens with that little girl when we show those stimuli. She was basically random for the upright and for the inverted stimuli. And we compared this with 2 other girls, one a 15-month-older and one a 9-month-older. They showed a strong preferential attention to the upright, okay? So that kind of made us think about it. Oh my God, you know, we showed 9 animations to this little girl, and she was random, except in one animation. And in one animation, she was entirely upright, Can you see? Entirely upright. And this is the animation, and I want you to watch it and tell me what happened here.
Patty cake, baker's man. Bake me a cake.
So what is happening here? What is happening is that you have the clapping, right? And when the clapping is happening, basically those lights, okay, they are hitting each other and they are making a synchronous sound. And we call this audiovisual synchrony, okay? When something happens visually and happens auditorily, okay? But that's a physical contingency, okay? It's not a social contingency, it's a physical contingency. And so then the idea would be, the hypothesis is that the reason why in this animation she was looking all upright is because not necessarily she was processing this as a social animation, but because she was attracted by the physical contingency of the clapping. So if so, where would she look at? She would look at the clapping. So this is her data.
Roll it and pat it and mark it.
So you see what she's looking at.
Make me.
Okay, so all right, so she's doing that. So the way that we usually do research, we start with one child and then we do groups of children. And so now we saw a group of children who are typically developing, okay, and they're all upright. Then we saw children who did not have autism but had cognitive delays, and they are also upright. But our children with autism, the 2-year-olds with autism, they were basically random, just like the little girl. And this is now what happened with patty cake. Now all of those 2-year-olds are also showing a preferential sort of attention to the upright, and the hypothesis was, gee, you know, is it possible that they are failing to see the social contingency of those animations, a foundational mechanism of socialization, but they were attracted by the physical contingency, which is the audiovisual synchrony. And so this is what we realized. What we realized is that the clapping was an extreme case of audiovisual synchrony. But there is audiovisual synchrony happening all the time as we're speaking. Take a look.
Ready?
Yeah. And the reason for that is because when we are people, we are communicators. We are a unit of communication. I may be speaking here, but together with my speech, every gesture that I make, my facial gestures, my body gestures, everything is synchronous. And it's very hard to desynchronize. You need to be a professional actor to do that, or sometimes a person with autism. Hello? That kind of a thing. And so, we understood that, you know, same stimuli, but they could be translated into basically lights and sounds. Okay, so forget that those things now are people. And just think in terms of audiovisual synchrony. What happened? We basically measured the amount of audiovisual synchrony in our stimuli, and this is a heat map. When you have a sort of a bright color, it's because there is a lot of audiovisual synchrony happening.
Play a game. Let's
So you
play
see?
patty cake.
And those things are
Ready?
momentary. Now, it gets really red with the clap, because the clap is a real extreme example of audiovisual synchrony. But there is audiovisual synchrony happening also on the other side, on the inverted animation. And so what we did is that we quantified the amount of audiovisual synchrony on the right and on the left, okay? And then we asked the question, could it be that our children, the way that they're looking at those animations, that their visual attention is being driven by the audiovisual synchrony, is being driven by the physical nature of the stimuli, okay? And what you see there is that there are 3 groups. There are the 2-year-olds with autism, there are the 2-year-olds who are typically developing, and there are the 2-year-olds with developmental disabilities without autism. And those curves are telling you that 90% of the visual behavior of the kids with autism was actually explained by audiovisual synchrony, and not so for the other 2 kids, for the other 2 groups of kids. And then we took another group of children with autism, did 2 additional experiments, and this is what this complex graph is telling you. It's telling you that indeed, the way that the children watched the stimuli that you saw, it was basically they were not seeing the people. They were basically seeing lights and sounds, and the more audiovisual synchrony there was in them, the more they would likely look at it. Now, you probably are asking the question, why are you boring us to tears with this audiovisual synchrony business? It's because the same children also watch stimuli like that.
Hi, sweetie. Are you ready to wake up? Come on. Did you sleep well?
Okay, so they watched caregivers approaching them, and this is now the data for that little girl watching this stimulus. So what do you see?
Hi, sweetie. Are you ready to wake up? Come on.
What is she paying attention to?
Oh,
So she's paying attention to that mouth. Now you tell me, why do you think she's paying attention to that mouth? It's because in the body, in us, the place with the greatest amount of audiovisual synchrony is the mouth. It's basically lip movements and speech sounds that could vary, right? And so she's looking at that. But in order for her to be driven to do that, what does she need not do? She need not process that caregiver as a caregiver. Okay? So that was the hypothesis. And then we did groups of children. And here you have data for 2-year-olds with autism, 2-year-olds who are developmentally disabled but not autistic, and 2-year-olds typically developing. And we realized that the kids with autism spend much less time looking at people's mouths and more time looking at people's, much less time looking at people's eyes and more time looking at people's mouths. As we did that kind of study, we really needed to nail that. Why is this girl being drawn to that speaking mouth?
Hi, sweetie.
Right?
Are you?
And so we rendered those caregivers talking to those babies as basically heat maps of audiovisual synchrony, as if they were physical stimuli, as if they were not people. And the more audiovisual synchrony, remember, the hotter the color, reds and yellows, okay? So now...
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder...
So you see how much audiovisual synchrony is going on momentarily. And then we basically look into the way that typically developing 2-year-olds, they watch those scenes of caregivers approaching them, and there was no relationship between the way they looked at it and the audiovisual synchrony. But this is what we got for the 2-year-olds with autism, which is a very high correlation. Interestingly, not only a correlation to the caregiver's eyes, to the caregiver's mouth, which you saw before, but also to the eyes. When they look at the eyes is when, because audiovisual synchrony is happening there in a way when they're moving around. Okay? So I'm not telling you that our children are not learning about people. I'm not telling that they're not able to develop the attachment with others I'm not telling you that. What I'm telling you is that they are learning about the world very, very differently. And it behooves us to know that. Because if that's their experiences, if their experiences caregivers as a composite of physical attributes, then their brains are going to basically reflect that too. Okay? So, still this little girl, okay? I wanted to know, how does she see the world as she is looking? And so we developed the technology to do eye tracking studies of babies, okay? And this is what the lab looks like. This is my colleague Warren Jones. This is very happy, typically developing 5-month-old baby, okay? So the baby is going to watch a caregiver, and as the baby is watching the caregiver, we are measuring what this baby is doing 60 times a second, okay? So you got the idea. Now, this is what this typically developing year 5-month-old was doing when watching a caregiver. This is in slow motion, of course, and they can hear the caregiver as well. But you see, so that little baby is falling in love with those eyes. Well, here is the thing. I mentioned to you today that the model of autism that we are sort of putting forward out there is that the autistic symptoms are in fact a result of the divergence from normative paths of development, okay? Now, most of the things that I told you about, for example, looking at people's eyes, this is from the first hours of life. Okay, listening to people's voice preferentially actually before they're born is 3rd trimester. By 35 weeks of age, they already show preferential attention to their mother's voice. And so the idea would be can we actually create growth charts of social engagement, of social visual engagement? Not unlike you have growth charts of height and weight, because if your child is a failure to thrive child and the child is dropping in that growth chart, you're going to be very worried, right? And so for us, creating those growth charts was a way of basically looking at deviations from the path that would be risk markers for later autism, okay? And that's what we did. So what you see now is a growth chart for eye looking in typically developing children from the age of 2 months to the age of 24 months. What that curve tells you is percent fixation time on eyes. From all the time that that baby was looking at those caregivers, how much of the time she spent, or in this case here, an entire group of babies spent looking at people's eyes. The graph on the bottom is the first derivative, which is basically the rate of change, okay? But at the top is percent fixation on eyes. And you see that it varies across the first years of life. In fact, what you see here is that from 2 months to 6 months, there is increasingly more eye looking, okay? And that coincides with times in which babies are learning about other people's smiles, about eye engagement and all this sort of things. But then it goes down for a period of time and it comes up again sort of towards the second year of life. Now, why this is interesting? It's interesting because now you see the curve for mouth looking. This is percent fixation time that those typical babies are looking at mouths from 2 to 24 months. And you see that sharp increase that happens around the age of 6 months, and it goes all the way to about 18 months, and then it comes down as well. And what does that coincide with? It coincides with speech. Those babies discover that from that mouth comes speech. And one of the things that actually scaffold word learning is looking at people's mouths, because speech is an audiovisual thing. And there are many sounds that are disambiguated through mouth movements. And those babies know it. And so in a way, they discover the mouth. And why does it go down towards sort of 18 months? Or so, it's because once they learn how to say words, and basically now they're saying many words, there is something called word explosion that happens. Now they know how to learn words, but they need to contextualize those words in social interaction, so that now those words mean intentions, they mean a whole bunch of things, including, for example, joint attention, which is basically taking cues from somebody's eyes and moving and expecting something that the other person is also attending to. And at that moment in time, if I want to know your intention, your emotions, I better look at people's eyes rather than people's mouths. And guess what? Babies know it. Okay? So having done that, then we wanted to know what happened with the children with autism. And this is now a 5-month-old little guy who was later diagnosed with autism. And tell me what he's looking at. So that 5-month-old was looking a great deal into that person's mouth. But he was also moving around whenever there was sort of synchronous gestures and things of that nature. So that's a very different way of looking at the caregiver. Now, remember, this is my growth chart of eye looking in typical babies from 2 months to 24 months. So what did the children with autism do? Okay? From the time that we began to follow them, which was 2 months. This is what they did. So they start way up there, and it's free fall for the first 24 months. And guess what? This is autism creating itself. Because those children are diverging more and more and more and more over the course of the first years of life. And then we did another study with another group of babies that we follow from the age of 2 months. And guess what? We got exactly the same results. So basically, talking about reward, I mean, the eyes are not very rewarding to our children with autism, and so what you see is this free fall. Okay? Well, when we did that kind of a thing, we start thinking, gee, what are those data telling us? And this is a very, very, very complex graph, and it's even more complex for me to explain without being able to point to it. But what you see on the panel on the left is basically the individual trajectories of children. In blue, you have the typical babies, and in red, you have the trajectories for the first 6 months of life of babies who are later diagnosed with autism, okay? And so I'm only going to summarize what this graph means. You can always read the papers. But what this means is this. Number one, that if I only collected data in the first 6 months of life, from 2 to 6 months of life, those data predicted the diagnostic classification of children at 24 and 36 months. So data of the first 6 months are predicting diagnostic classification at the age of 24 to 36 months. So there were markers of these children with autism beginning at the age of 2 months. Okay? Now, what this graph tells you, is that if I take that eye-looking curve that I told you, not only that it predicts the classification, the diagnostic classification of the children later on, it also predicts their level of social disability. Because I'm basically modeling something called the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, which is basically a diagnostic test. It is also a test that gives you a sense of the level of autistic disability. And the eye-looking data were sufficient for us to predict the level of disability that children would be at 24, 36 months. So we know then that those kinds of really, I wouldn't say that those things are causing autism. The one thing that I'm saying is that those things are truly reflecting the process of autism unfolding. Okay? Now, when we had that kind of, those kinds of results, we start asking ourselves the question, this seems to be so close to what autism really is. And we have a puzzle. The puzzle comes from the field of genetics. Because I told you that autism is the most strongly genetic of all complex neurodevelopmental conditions, didn't I? And I showed you I told you the recurrence rates among SIP-SHIPs and things like that. But we asked ourselves the question, if this thing is really important for socialization and disruption thereof seems to be predicting autism, could it be that this is what is heritable in autism? Because nobody in this world, despite so much progress in molecular genetics, has been able to basically map genes or genetic findings in autism and the behaviors. There is a huge chasm in between those two. So the question then becomes, we know it's strongly genetic, we are doing this research all the time, but what is heritable? Okay? In order to do this kind of work, we basically did this kind of studies with twins. And why do we study twins? We studied fraternal twins, and we studied identical twins. The identical twins are carbon copies of each other, and the fraternal twins are only 50% of DNA shared. And so, if you have a difference in the agreement between the two twins for a particular behavior, the stronger or the larger the difference between the agreement in the identical twins relative to the fraternal twins, the more genetic a behavior is. Does that make sense to you guys? You must have read some twin research. And so this is all work, okay, with typical twins. All right? Typical twins, many monozygous or identical, many dizygous or fraternal. And so this is the work that we did. They all watch those kinds of stimuli that I just showed you. Some are caregivers approaching them, but some were actually toddlers playing. We call this peer play, okay? More complex social situations. But the twins would watch those things in different rooms at different times, okay? Remember that. Now, this is what two fraternal twins were doing when they are watching that video. I brought the data together. You see two crosshairs, right? But remember, they're not watching together. They're watching at different times. See what you see here. Okay? Now let's now watch identical twins watching the same stimuli. So what is happening is that the amount of agreement is much, much higher. Do you want to know how much? So remember, two twins watching those kinds of stimuli, caregiver approaching a baby, and this is what we did. The first box on the left is basically, these are non-siblings, so there'll be no, they're basically, we shouldn't expect any agreement. And the steeper the curve, the more agreement there is, okay? And what you have at the farthermost right there is something called interclass correlation, which is the level of agreement between two twins, okay? So for now, you are on the left. First, non-siblings, then siblings, then non-siblings who are age-matched and sex-matched, and then fraternal twins, and then identical twins. The difference is between 0.91 of agreement in identical twins relative to 0.35 in fraternal twins. What does that mean? It means that the behavior that they are showing is definitely genetically determined, is under strict genetic control. We tested this again, but 50 months later. And the same thing was happening, which basically meant that that genetic determination was absolutely strong and it was stable. And then we start going crazy, because now you see at the top, these are identical twins, the middle one is fraternal twins, and the bottom one is the age matched, okay? But they're not related. And remember that the steeper the curve, the more agreement there is. So the first here, what you're seeing is that if we compare only the videos that both twins saw, because there are many videos, you know, children don't spend a ton of time with us. Some see some videos, some see other videos. We just took the videos that both saw, and we saw that agreement. First, all videos. Second, only those that both saw, the intersection. And then you start going crazy. Now we compare what they did with videos that they didn't see. Both twins. Some twins saw these videos and some twins saw those videos. And it's exactly the same results. And then we went crazy, and we basically analyzed the data using two categories of video. Caregivers approaching the baby and peers at play. And guess what? It was exactly the same thing. So basically what this was telling us, it was telling us that this behavior, which is basically searching the information about people, is under enormous genetic control. So you want to see how much? This is now a very complex social situation with those kids going around, right? And you see two crosshairs, right? These are two fraternal twins watching that video in separate rooms. Can you see? Now let's take a look at two identical twins watching that video. So this is basically, those kids are watching this video separately, and they are doing things that are very similar indeed. And what we found out is that the identical twins, moment by moment, they are much more likely than the fraternal twins to somehow go and look something, so they are moving their eyes at the same time, in the same directions, to the same semantic content. What does that mean? They are searching faces at the same time, they're searching objects at the same time, at the same moments in time. So we're really talking here about microscales of tens of milliseconds of agreement. So this is how genetically controlled this was. But here is another thing that we did then. Now that we know that this is under genetic control, we also completed those procedures with toddlers with autism. They're all about 21-month-olds. And what we're saying, this is the data for the typical twins that I just showed you. And this is now the data for for the 2-year-olds with autism. Basically, mouth looking and eye looking. And what you're seeing is that the very behaviors that under strict genetic control are also the behaviors that are segregating. They are separating the children with autism from their typical peers. Not only for one group of kids with autism, but really for two groups of kids with autism. So what does that mean? It means that we seem to come closer now to know what is heritable in autism. Because we know that those behaviors are under strict genetic control, and those things differentiate the kids. So, but here is for the interventionists among you. What did I just show you? I show you that the way that our children are learning about people, the way they're looking about people, is highly heritable, and they are basically looking at the same place at the same time. But most importantly, they're not only reacting to the stimuli, they are seeking those stimuli in very much the same time. So what are they doing? This is the typical kids. They are creating their world. If they are creating their world and our kids are diverging, what are our kids doing? They are creating their world. And that world is called autism. Okay? So if you're doing so, that will have an impact on your brain development. Okay? Now, I'm still thinking about this little girl, okay? But here is the thing. I told you that this is the battleground of social development. Okay? So that's where we learn. We learn if you're experiencing a situation, you're learning about people's behaviors, intentions, emotions, beliefs, conflict research, conflict resolution, that kind of, or lack thereof. So this is, the problem for us has been for years and years, is that we know that this is the battleground for social development and for brain development, but how do we measure how people are? My computer almost went. I know you have good theory of mind, so hopefully I was not being crazy, I was just catching my computer. So how do we measure the way that the children are experiencing those things? One of the big things in autism is that two different people may be watching the same thing, and even looking at the same place, but they may be in fact experiencing something very different, okay? But this is the kind of a thing that we needed to do. So we needed to find a way of how do we measure the way that our children experience social situations, like the videos that we're giving them. So remember that this is a frame of video that are 30 frames per second, and this is a frame of video, okay? Remember this is it. So let's call this. Now, what you see there is right in the middle is it's an equation. You see a little graph there? This is the amount of visual resources that 1 2-year-old is devoting to that point of that screen at that moment in time, on that frame. Why do I say this? It's because if you look at people's eyes, like the primate eye, the cells that are receptive to light, they're not distributed uniformly. There are lots of cells right in the middle of our visual field, and we see things with great resolution if they fall right in the middle of our visual field. But as we move to the periphery, it's very sparse. And we can pick up movement, but we can't get resolution. That's why if something is really important in life, you will focus on it, okay? And so, you got it? So what that equation means is that we map the retina of primates, and it tells you that there is a lot of visual resources, a lot of photoreceptive cells in the middle, and then there is a major decay. Do you see the equation in there? It's a little mountain. You see? That's one child. Now let's talk about 40 children looking at that frame, okay? And this is what you get. So the children are looking at slightly different spots, but what you have there is that if they are converging, the lights are getting hotter, and they are getting hotter because there are more children focused on that spot. Okay? Can you see that? Great. Now, let's take a different, this is a frame of video, by the way. So let's take a sort of a different sort of view. Let's look at it from a bird's eye view. This is what we call a salience map. It's a map of what is important on that frame. Because the hotter the spots, the more children are looking at. Okay? Do you get that? Thank you. So let's now watch the same video through the eyes of 40 typically developing 2-year-olds. Do you see what's going on? Oh, it's too fast for you? Okay, I'm going to go frame by frame. All right. So you're now watching. Oh, something important happened. Oh, gone. Ooh. But you see, now you're watching that video through the eyes of those 40-year-olds, those 42-year-olds, and you're seeing the hotter colors, the reds and the yellows, particularly the reds, when there is a convergence of collective looking, which tells us that something really important is happening there. Okay? Good. Let's take another view of it. So you have a frame of video, and now the z-axis is time. Okay? And there are lots of frames. Now, let's carve that saliency map across time. So now what you're seeing is basically is no longer just two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional. And we call this a funnel of attention, which basically, when there is nothing going on of importance on the video, there is a lot of dispersion because children are everywhere. But if something really important happens, there is a funneling, basically a contraction, and you see the red colors there. So now you can watch this. You can watch the same video, okay, through that funnel, and that funnel is telling you, well, what Andy Meltzoff, a nice child developmentalist, calls hotspots of socialization. Moments in time in which you better pay attention, because otherwise you're not going to understand what's going on. And the kids are telling us what they are, if you follow. So you see, in the first panel, you see? Now, let's take another example here. Let me see if I can stop it. Okay? So something really, really, really important is happening because it's all red, right? So let's see what is happening there. I keep telling you that people fall in love with people's eyes and people's faces, but sometimes whose face? There are lots of faces to pay attention to. But maybe, just maybe, what is going on? Oh, the children are not paying attention to faces. They are paying attention to something in between those two children. Can you see? And what is happening there? Well, the child on the left is doing this. What is this? This is a joint attention cue. That child is looking at an object in between them. And those 2-year-olds all picked up that cue, that momentary cue, and they're all looking at the same place because the child's gaze is pointing. This is where the action is. They're fighting over that object. Do you get it? Okay. So this is what we did. And what we found out is that when we researched basically lots of 2-year-olds, I mean, do you guys know 2-year-olds? I mean, you can hardly sort of get them to be in a room together. But as they are watching those videos, 80% of the time they're looking at the same place at the same spot. And because of that, we call this entrainment. Those videos are entraining them. These are basically moments of enculturation. They are having the same experiences. And therefore, now they have a shared body of experiences that they can use in order to interact and talk. Remember that one of my problems with Robert and Mark is that, you talk to some individuals and there is a clear sense that we're not sharing the same framework of experiences and everything needs to be defined and explicitly spoken and so forth. That's where it comes from. And this starts very early on in life. Okay? Now, let's take just one example. This is just one frame of that video. This now is a typical funnel. This is for the 2-year-olds who are typical, okay? And now, this is now, what you're seeing are what we call scan paths. These are 2-year-olds with autism watching the same video. Do you see that they are crossing that frame in different places? So what are the typical kids looking at? What are the kids with autism looking at? So they're watching the same video, But the typical kids are paying attention to the emotional expressions of that boy. Our kids with autism are paying attention to the opening and closing of that door. Okay? Now, those convergences that the typical kids showed us, you know, they happen in the hundreds. In 5 minutes of video, there are over 500 convergences. These are momentary moments of social learning that they are picking up important things in what they are watching. They are converging. And our kids are diverging over 500 times. So basically, our kids are missing over 500 opportunities for social learning in 5-6 minutes of video. So when I told you that our kids are diverging in their development and that somehow the autism is being created, that's what they're doing. They are doing this moment by moment by moment by moment. Now, over 500 divergences in 5 to 6 minutes, it translates into thousands over the course of hours. So for the interventionists among you, when we say that we want to provide 1 hour of treatment a week to our children, what do you think? Is that going to make a difference? Okay? So that's an important thing that I'm telling you, because that's going to determine what kind of treatment we should implement with very young children. This is a time in which basically autism is creating itself. And the kids are basically creating their own autism in the way that they are looking at the world. Okay? Now, if you want to know what is happening, so what you see is that the top are the typically developing 2-year-olds, and the bottom is the 2-year-olds with autism. And you see at the left is basically the data of the right presented differently with those salience maps that tell you what they are focusing on. Okay? Do you see what they are focusing on? The amount, the boy is looking at that door, that's when the typical kids look, and then back and forth and back and forth. Now, I didn't tell you, but the movie had a happy ending. Okay? But let's look where they're looking at. Look where the typical kids are looking at. They are looking at the spot of the culmination of that experience, whereas our kids are everywhere. They watch the same video, the experience is entirely different. Can you see? So, because we're able to quantify social behavior to this level, we wanted to know if we could use those kinds of assays of social visual engagement as a way of predicting basically level of disability. And so we have a measure, it's a measure of relative entrainment, is the extent to which one child is diverging from all of those typical children, okay? And this is what he showed. What he showed is that if we conducted that experiment at the age of 24 months, that 5-minute experiment was predicting ADOS, basically level of autistic social disability, at the level of a correlation of 0.45. But if we measured that 1.5 years later, the experiment at 24 months, the 5-minute experiment at 24 months, was predicting level of social disability 15 months later at the level of a correlation of 0.758. Now, for those of you who are not into that kind of stuff, it's basically saying that that freaking thing is predicting a ton. And it's predicting more of behavior in the future that is presented in the present, because that assay in the experiment is an assay of social learning. And that social learning is creating disability subsequently. Okay? I'm not going to go over this, but the funny part is that it was not only predicting level of autistic social disability, it was also predicting level of nonverbal and verbal intelligence in those little guys. And why this is so? It was predicting that because, do you know how we learn about the world? We learn about the world through others. And if we're not paying attention to others, the likelihood that we're not going to learn is greater. The likelihood that you're going to develop intellectual disability is greater. So I always thought that the intellectual disability in autism was a given. It's something in the brain, isn't it? And what we're seeing is that the intellectual disability is a result of the social disability. Now, if it is a result of the social disability, what does that tell us? It tells us that maybe if we are able to normalize the social function, we might be able to have a tremendous impact on IQ, on learning. And now we are in the third generation of kids that we follow from birth. We are now intervening at the age of 6 months. And guess what? We just published a meta-analysis, which is like lots of studies together. And the kids who are followed from very early on, they basically are not displaying major intellectual delays. So you know what that means? It means that the intellectual disability itself, with probably the exception of a tiny minority of cases of kids who have single gene disorders that are devastating, most kids don't have that, but for the vast majority of kids, the intellectual disability may be a product of their social disability. Were we to be able to address that, their intellectual skills by the age of 3 would be okay. They'll be speaking. They would go to inclusive kindergartens. I'm not saying that they would not have challenges like we know so many high-functioning kids have, but believe me, a child who is speaking fluently, it's a different kind of child than a child who doesn't speak at all. Okay? So now I'm going to use the rest of my time to tell you what are the implications of this research to addressing the thing that I started in the beginning, the big public health challenge that I've mentioned to you. I told you that our kids are not being identified early. We are not intervening early. And we don't do that because from the time that a parent is worried about their child, it takes, according to the CDC, 3.5 years for them to get in the hands of an expert clinician. We just don't have expert clinicians. We don't have access to those services. And if we don't identify the children, we don't provide them with early intervention, then we're going to see them later on in life, and it's going to be a different ballgame. Okay? So that's the reason why a big thing that we have done, I showed you some pieces of research, but now I need to translate how does that, what does that mean in terms of augmenting access to diagnostic services and providing treatment, okay? But I'll take a couple of questions, please.
Maybe you're going to discuss this later, but how would you suggest we work with very, very young children?
Okay, so that's part of the presentation, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you. Are you suggesting that your meta-analysis suggests that you can prevent intellectual disability?
Right now, what we can say is this. You compare groups of children who participate in research. How did they get to the research? One possibility is that they were referred by someone in the community or a parent was concerning, and you're seeing them for the first time at the age of 24 to 36 months. You compare that group with another group. This is the group that was followed from very early on in infancy. And because they are followed several times, you've been intervening. Because you've been talking to parents, you've been training parents, you've been doing this sort of things. If you compare those two groups of kids, the kids who are basically followed from early on in life at 24 to 36 months, their developmental scores is close to 1.5 to 2 standard deviations above those who are clinically referred. That's what I'm saying.
And also a follow-up. So does your research suggest that you can prevent or reverse the earliest signs of autism?
See, that's a profound question, okay?
I would love a profound answer.
I'll tell you why it's a profound question. Because if you're following the gist of what I'm telling you, autism is not necessarily what we define today as autism. You know, autism is a bunch of symptoms that come together, and it's often, associated with intellectual disability, language disability, and severe behavior challenges. But if you're following what I'm telling you, particularly the genetic piece, what is inherited is a trait, and the trait is basically an attenuated sense of people. It's sociability. The trait has to do with the fact that I don't learn intuitively about people. I'm not turning to people, that kind of stuff. That's only a trait. So in my life, if all of the kids who had that trait, okay, they did not have intellectual disability, they did not have language disabilities, they succeed in schools, and they were in vocational programs, I don't want to change them necessarily. Because I'm not in the business of curing kids. Because if this is a trait of being in the world, Who am I to say that this is better or worse? I'm telling you, is worse if it causes disability. But if it is just a way of being in the world, walk into Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon? I think it's in the state. So walk there. There's a lot of people there who are, are not obsessed about others. Walk into Georgia Tech. Walk into MIT. So what I'm saying is that there are different ways of being in this world. I'm obsessed about people, so I'm a psychologist, right? But there are some people who are obsessed about machines, or they're obsessed about programming. Walk into Microsoft. So what I'm saying is this: I'm not sure that I'm in the business of changing traits. I'm in the business of optimizing outcomes. So I'm not in the business of curing autism if autism is a trait. I definitely, because I spent too much of my life going to people's homes and looking at the misery, some families that are basically in a state of siege and there's plexiglass on their windows because the kids smear feces all over the place and they have elopement, they run away and all this kind of stuff. That is not good. Nobody's going to tell me that this is a trait. That's a major disability. But the trait itself, I'm not sure. It's just a different way of being in the world. And unless we begin to realize that, we will not realize the responsibility that we have. Because if I'm telling you that this is malleable, it's within our reach to change that, but we need to change this as a society. See what I mean? Okay, so let me move on now and tell you what this all means, okay? The first thing that we wanted to do is to see the extent to which we could actually translate that science into something that would augment access to services. So this is my colleague Warren Jones, and we've been using this kinds of quantifications of social behavior that I just showed you. See, what happened if we could create a procedure that does not require an expert clinician, and it could be basically conducted by a technician in a mobile device. We take our entire lab and put it into a mobile device, and we put into the community. So that's basically what we have been doing, and we have been using those kinds of data, typical data, as a way of using growth charts that can pick up risk in other kids. Okay, I'm going to try and be very streamlined now because I don't have time to go into greater detail about this. But basically what we did, we tested 1,059 16 to 30-month-old toddlers. The reason why we focus on this age group is for those of you who work with birth to 3, there is a federal mandate to provide early intervention services. But we can only provide those services if children are identified. So we focus on this age group. And we use about 689 kids to create the model. This is how you measure things. And then we use another group of kids, 187, another 183, to test the model. Okay? And so this is basically the summation of hundreds of those momentary divergences of kids with autism, okay? So we are quantifying behavior over and over and over and over and over again as they're watching those videos. And these are the results. The results is that if you complete a 12-minute procedure using those kinds of experiments, we are able to basically reach a level of accuracy. Accuracy is something called sensitivity and something called specificity. Sensitivity means how many kids the device said yes, and an expert clinician said yes, and then specificity, which is basically how many kids the device said no, and the expert clinician said no. Okay, this is the kind of things that people use in order to test any test in pediatrics or in any test really. Okay, and we reach a level of 83% of sensitivity and 83% of specificity. This is almost as good as testing for a strep throat. So this is a 12-minute procedure basically done by a technician. And then we look into, what about the false positives? Who are the kids that we're picking up with this device who don't have autism? And here is basically the kids. And the vast majority of the kids that we're picking up as false positives are kids who have developmental concerns. They have problems with language. They have problems with some rigidity. They have problems with all these things, but they don't meet criteria for autism. You know, I don't know what you feel about this, but Leo Kanner described the term autism. He wasn't God. And the notion that even DSM, and I work in DSM-4, not DSM-5, basically the world does not exist in categories. And the autistic trait that you asked me about is actually distributed normally. My colleague John Constantino has done a lot of work on that. And what we are picking up is basically those cases that they are not autistic, but they are not typical either. Okay? Now, from a birth to 3 standpoint, that's actually great news, because those kids have actionable delays, by which I mean that they would benefit from services as well. And when we look into how much did we pick up in terms of the level of disability, that 12-minute procedure relative to an ADAS, what this thing is telling you here is that basically about 78% of the social disability is being predicted by that 12-minute assessment, 12-minute experiment. This is according to the ADAS. But it's more than that. We're capturing about 63% of children's verbal age equivalence. That 12-minute is also basically capable of predicting level of verbal skills, which is great for us, because what do you need to create a program for a young child? You need those kinds of developmental information. So we're very happy with that thing, and it was capturing about 0.50 percent of the variance or of nonverbal IQ. So it captures much more verbal than nonverbal, probably because the verbal is much more tied up with the social disability. And so now we have a device. We just completed a clinical trial around the country in 6 places, in Seattle, in Seattle Children's, UCSF, Rush in Chicago, Cincinnati Children's, and Phoenix at Emory. And those data now have been collected on over 500 kids. This is a new group of kids. And now what's going to happen is that we're going to analyze those data. We haven't begun the analysis quite yet. But hopefully we'll be able to get this through clearance for FDA. And if so, then we have something that we can offer the community. And this is how it works.
Here. Just like the car. It's just like the cars. Okay. Swing them in here.
So this is basically a training video for technicians. So the technician is basically doing that, and the child is watching those videos in 12 minutes, or until there is enough data collected. And then the data basically goes to the cloud, and then we have processes to analyze the quality of data and to basically put in the data model, which analyzes the data. And the goal is to get the report back to the referring clinician in 24 hours. So that's the idea. Now, NIH liked this work, and they asked us to do something else. Because this is what I showed you is a diagnostic device. It's something that we would use for children who have been referred to a provider, for example, because the parent was concerned or somebody was concerned. But the big issue that NIH is asking now is, can we use those kinds of technologies to basically do all screening? You know, because the screeners that we have for development in autism are not so hot. And if we had something that would be more objective and quantitative, it would be helpful. So we just got a grant now from NIH to downward extend that device from children who are 16 to 30 months to 9-month-olders. And the idea is that we'll be parking that little bus outside of a pediatric facility, like a primary care physician's office. And as children complete their well baby checkups at the age of 9 months, they're also going to complete this procedure. And the goal would be to do community-wide screening for both risk for autism, but developmental delays more generally. Now, let's put some lessons here. Number one, we needed to deal with access
to diagnostic services. So we need high throughput, low cost deployment of universal screening in the community. We need early detection and we need early intervention, and there is a possibility for us to significantly attenuate the burdens of autism, okay? The other thing that we have been learning is that, funny thing, those behaviors that we measure are under tremendous, strict genetic control. Does that mean that we have no interventions to offer our children? It's genetic, isn't it? So the children are doomed. Well, not quite. Not quite, because the way that they engage with the world naturally is under genetic control. But there is another side, and that other side is what? Is the environment. If they are building their own environment, maybe we can engineer that environment in such a way that we can normalize a little their engagement, okay? So that's the reason why I mentioned that what I showed you informs the level of treatment. We have an enormous challenge. 66,000 children born every year, I mentioned this to you. 700,000 children with autism receive special education school services, a cost of $37 billion a year. But then this is only 1.7% of the population, but 10% of the population has some form of developmental disability. So the kinds of public health challenge that we have in our hands is huge, right? So we better pay attention to. And one of the learnings of the past, certainly 5-6 years, is that the very kind of things, I just mentioned to you the diagnostic test, right? It's not only autism. Did you see that we could also predict developmental status? I'm talking about verbal skills. So we realized that these things have benefit to a much broader group of kids. 10% of our population actually have actionable developmental delays. And also kids with other concerns, kids with extreme preterms, 8% of them develop autism. Kids with congenital heart disease who undergo surgery in the first year of life, 8% of them have autism. And both groups of kids have, a great risk for other developmental delays. And kids with genetic conditions like Williams syndrome and whatnot. So then the idea became, how can we engineer that environment? And so we've been working with Amy Weatherby from Florida and with other folks, and the focus has been here, how can we engineer that environment? If 1 hour of expert services for the lucky ones who get birth to 3 eligibility is not good enough because our kids are diverging, remember? So often, we need to create a level of intensity of services that basically the therapy should be every waking moment. How can you achieve that? Well, you achieve that by training parents. So you achieve that by basically training parents to become engineers of social engagement. Is that possible? Yes, it is. Does he have a positive outcome? Yes, he does. So the funny part is that, kids from low-income environments, poor kids, do you know how high risk they are for language delays and disabilities? Why? Are they biologically predetermined? It's the same story. It's the story that in order for kids to learn to speak, people need to speak to them. They need to engage with them. They need to be there all the time. And so we realized that rather than just, trying to move this forward for the kids with autism, the people who are in public health are going to listen to us, including the physicians. They're going to listen to us if we say, by the way, this is actually important for kids in general.
Babies learn to talk at an amazing rate. They go from sounds to words to sentences in the first 2 years. Before they can talk, babies watch what you do, listen to what you say, and try to figure out what you mean. Every month, babies reach important new milestones, but the ones that matter most are the ones that come before they can talk. Our social communication growth charts can help you learn these critical milestones. Explore hundreds of video clips that show you how to support your child's learning in ordinary, everyday moments. Chart your child's development to monitor which milestones they've reached, which are emerging, and which ones to look for in the coming weeks and months. Everything you do and say matters, especially during this critical time when your baby's brain is developing the most rapidly and is shaped by the experiences you provide. Learn how to turn everyday activities into learning moments. Every moment counts and learning never stops. Find out what's in store for your baby each month. This is the most important role of your life.
Now, did you hear the word autism? No. That's the idea. The idea here is that what you're seeing in this picture, this is the mother. This is not the expert clinician. The expert clinician is behind, is training that mother. So now we're also training caregivers remotely, because the caregiver is wearing a bug in the ear, and our interventionists are within the center basically giving instructions on how to build what speech-language pathologists would call the temptations. And we're engineering this one moment at a time, and we're training the parents on how to reach fluency on how to do those things so that they can then use this all the time. And the training platform, this is the Autism Navigator. What you saw before is something called the First Words Project. Pennsylvania was the first funder. The state of Pennsylvania was the first funder of the Autism Navigator. Okay, it's one of the implementing sites of the Autism Navigator. But so in a way, there is an online platform that primary care physicians and mothers, fathers, caregivers, as well as early interventionists can actually train on all this sort of stuff. And he creates something that Amy Weatherby calls the ecosystem, the electronic communication systems that allows for physicians and interventionists and parents to be all on the same page. But it's all about that. And this parent-delivered early social interaction is a direct result of what I've mentioned to you before. It is the need to reach a level of intensity, and we can only do that if we use everyday experiences. And we can only do that if we engage the parents or the caregivers. And the notion is that we use all of those things that they do all the time. And then we start. We start by creating that kind of common agenda, which is basically that shared platform. We move on to the serve and return and social reciprocity even before we begin to teach language. Because yes, we will be able to teach language. Yes, we'll be able to teach words. But if the words are outside of the context of social interaction, then we're back to square one. In a way, our kids are going to be speaking, but it's going to be not unlike what I showed you today, which is somehow outside of the realm of action. Okay? And so imagine that in doing so, we have goals in that form of intervention called social interaction that are goals for the children and that are goals for the parents. And the goals for the parents are as important as the goals for the children. And it's all part of the same training packaging. And so that, in a way, is the way. So I wouldn't like to do, if I had a choice between a wonderful expert clinician, 1 hour a week, and having this program, I will have this program. Because the idea is that we need to use what we have, which is the everyday experience for young children, for the young children that I'm talking to you about. And then every time we play, every time we have a meal, every time we share with books or we play, all those chores, these are all opportunities for us to intervene. And this is good not only for the children with autism, but for a wide range of children. And then it goes to answering the question that you posed before. We are not in the business of curing autism. It will be a little bit like for me to say, I'm looking at you. You have dark hair, right? I'm colorblind, so you have dark hair, and I want to cure you from your dark hair. So it wouldn't be right for me to say something like that, but only if it is a trait and is not associated with disabilities. That's what we are trying to reach. Now, a lot of this science has been around for a long time, just not in autism. So this is Jack Shonkoff at Harvard, and he has been, using some of those kinds of constructs with children who are at great risk, children who are maltreated and poor kids who go through adverse experiences and so forth. This is my colleague, David Willis at HRSA. He has the concept of relational health, but the whole idea, and this is some of the public health campaigns that we have in Georgia, Talk with Me Baby. This is not a campaign on autism. It's a campaign for basically at-risk mothers, pregnant teens, poor environments, and we need to teach them basically the importance of their role in early brain development. That's the idea. So let me read it to you because I have 1 minute. This is what I would like for you to take away today. Autism is a massive public health challenge and an enormous public health opportunity. Children's lifetime outcomes can be optimized if we are able to create community uptake of early detection, we increase access to diagnostic services, and we increase access to early intervention. But we need community viable treatments. The greatest burdens of autism are not inevitable, and they can be significantly attenuated. Intellectual disability, language disability, severe behavior challenges. What moves early brain development is reciprocal social engagement, and early experiences shape the trajectories of social and communication skills in social communicative brain. Now, our research hopefully illustrated to you those constructs, and it also informs the kind of interventions that we want to advance. Infants and toddlers create their own social environment. These behaviors are under stringent genetic control. I showed you the data, and disrupted in the case of young children with autism. But we can engineer social learning experiences via manipulation of children's environments, via parent-delivered treatments. We need cost-effective and community-viable solutions. Solutions for screening and diagnosis are not too far off. I showed you some of them sort of emerging today. Solutions for early treatment are also being studied. We just completed a grant that involved, I think, 12,000 kids in 4 different, it was Kathy Lord in New York, it was Craig Schaefer in Philadelphia, it was us in Georgia, and Amy Weatherby in Florida. Solutions for optimized development of children with autism are relevant to a much broader group of kids. And now goes to the essence of it, the future of neurodevelopmental medicine, which is basically what we do for developmentally vulnerable kids. A lot of people are waiting for something to be discovered. The cause of autism, the cause, too complex. We shouldn't wait. We don't need to wait. Right now, we can optimize children's outcomes because there may be a multiplicity of causes, hundreds of causes. But what those causes, they seem to do is to disrupt normative development. Results thereof is autism. And if so, then our need then to do is how can we normalize that early experience so that we don't get our kids to basically create a world that is extraordinarily divergent from the world of their peers. And if so, maybe in the not too distant future, we may start talking about autism in a different way. Maybe we can create a different narrative for this condition, a narrative of diversity rather than a narrative of disability. Now, I grew up with autism being a medical condition. I mean, immutable. Okay, I need to make sure that the kids did not, bash their heads against the wall at the time. What we have learned since then is that this is not inevitable. It's both a possibility, and I see personally, but hopefully as a community as well, we can all feel that it's also our responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so important for the early detection and diagnosis to have better outcomes. Great session. Remember that anyone seeking social work CEUs must sign in and out daily at the registration desk. Please complete an evaluation for this session through the conference website. The session number is 68, and again, I just want to remind you of the patent pod in room 115 after this session I think they're open till 4:30 today. The session number is 68, and the code is TOP, T-O-P 156. It is TOP 156. Thank you. Have a great evening.